Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
Andrew, which do you like better, white or pink? Caroline asked, lying on the big bed with her phone in her hands. She'd been looking for a wedding bouquet for a week, and she couldn't decide. I like both, Andrew replied politely but without much interest, barely glancing at the photo. Why is it so difficult? She questioned, feigning anguish. I'll order any of them. Why does it even matter? Chuckling, the groom asked, switching off the lamp. You don't understand. Everything has to be perfect. Caroline gave him a surprised look and continued her search. 6 months had passed since Andrew had proposed to her, and there wasn't a day that went by that Caroline didn't talk about the upcoming wedding. She was endlessly booking and choosing things, consulting with her friends. Everything else seemed to have lost its importance to her. Andrew, on the contrary, was rather annoyed by the endless preparations. He tried to stay away and observe what was happening as an outside spectator, and then on the day of the wedding to participate in the prepared event as an actor in the play. Andrew, Caroline said, you're not helping at all, complained his mum. Mum, don't you start. Someone has to pay for this whole extravaganza. Well, that's me. In case you've forgotten, I work, and I don't care what color the cake is or what they serve it in. The son brushed it off. He did work hard, even though his parents were well-to-do people, but the only thing he owed them was a good education. They never spared any money for it. However, having received his diploma, the son never once asked for help. On the contrary, he tried to help himself. Now, when he was to start a family, Andrew felt even more responsibility. The bride was used to luxury. Her father and mother raised her like a princess. She got everything she wanted, from expensive clothes to trips abroad. After marriage, she will hardly want to limit herself in anything. Parents on both sides, who once had introduced the young people, were very pleased with this union. Both are handsome, with serious education, ambitions, business. What else do their mums need? In fact, they couldn't stand each other. They carefully pretended friendship, exchanged recipes, praised their children, and pestered their husbands with gossip about each other. Fathers took things much easier. When they met, they discussed business and the latest news. No, but did you see the dress she was wearing today? 50 years old, and she still looks like a girl. Mrs. Ann Pete was outraged after a family evening with her parents and Caroline. Oh, come on, really. Whatever she wants to wear, she wears. In one attempt to shut the subject down, her husband grudgingly replied. With the wedding a week away, all the women lost their peace. Caroline worried about her jewelry. The mums were busy revising the festive menu. Andrew stayed late at work every day just to avoid talking about the upcoming festivities. Of course, he couldn't do that because everyone was looking to him for advice or at least approval. Another unpleasant conversation took place with his mother right before the celebration. Andrew, she turned to her son as he sat on the sofa in her living room. What he asked nonchalantly, leaning back against the large, soft backrest. You don't like these wedding preparations after all, she said condescendingly. Have mercy, Andrew replied jokingly. It's been months now, with no end in sight. Yes, I'd give anything to make this day go by as quickly as possible. Okay, you're kidding. I can see Caroline's worried. She's trying. You don't seem very happy about it. Mrs. Ann Pete looked at her son warily and continued. Are you still in pain over that iris of yours? I told you not to talk about it, Andrew said sternly. And if that's why you called me here, I'd better go. Come on, why are you so quick? I was just asking. I want you to be happy. But Andrew wasn't convinced by the last words. He packed up and soon left for home. "You are nervous after all," said Mrs. Ann Pete, looking out of the window as the car drove out of the gate. "Well, what a thing. You still haven't forgotten." At last the long-awaited day came. A whole team came to see them in the morning: photographer, makeup artist, hairdresser. The morning of the bride photo shoot went perfectly. Caroline was satisfied and immediately went on business. Andrew stayed at home, realizing that the first photo shoot role was enough for him. They arrived at the registry office in different cars. The groom in a beautiful blue suit with a butterfly and a white flower in his buttonhole waited for the bride with the guests at the entrance to the building. A large white limousine pulled up. Andrew opened the door and offered his hand to his beautiful bride. The crowd applauded with admiration. Caroline was truly beautiful in a lush cream dress with open shoulders and elegantly styled hair. The delicate makeup, earrings and necklace around her neck shone in the summer sunshine. Andrew handed her a bouquet of delicate pink flowers that he had managed to pick up from the shop on his way out. Then the whole procession moved inside. Snow-white columns, a staircase, golden banisters covered with a red carpet, crystal chandeliers under the ceiling. It was a real old palace. Caroline really wanted the registration to take place here. When the couple entered the hall, the mums couldn't help but admire the children. Mrs. Ann Pete even folded her arms across her chest and cried. Such a sweet and touching moment. At the words of the wedding registrar about love and fidelity, cried all the women present. After the exchange of rings, kisses, bouquets, hugs, and photo session, the newlyweds and guests went to the embankment, where on one side there was a well-maintained green park, and on the other, sparkling water. The photos here turned out just great. While the guests drank champagne and admired the views, the newlyweds and the photographer went aside to a white gazebo to take some beautiful shots. Caroline posed contentedly. Andrew tried to play along, but wished to himself that it would all be over soon. They stepped back to a bench with a huge flowering bush towering over it. The bride's bouquet, which its owner had so carefully chosen, remained lying on the side of the arbor. Suddenly a boy appeared from behind the trees. He ran up, grabbed the flowers and rushed across the path into the thickest bushes. Before everyone realized what was happening, the boy had disappeared. Andrew saw his wife's confused face, ready to cry. After all, she had been preparing for this day for so long, and everything should have gone perfectly. And now this. "Well, I'll catch up with him and bring him back in 5 minutes." He calmed his fiancée and quickly went in the direction where half a minute ago the boy disappeared. "That's odd." He didn't look like a street kid, dressed normally, like all teenagers, hair and hands clean. He didn't look like he came from a wealthy family, but he wasn't poor either. But why did he need someone else's wedding bouquet? The boy ran down the street, holding the flowers to his chest. Whether he realized that he was being chased was unclear. He was in a hurry, moving along the edge of the footpath, so that cyclists and passers-by wouldn't get in his way. Mums with prams, schoolchildren, grandmothers, many turned round, watching the strange sight of a man in a groom's suit running after a child with flowers in his hands. Finally, Andrew stopped and wanted to turn back. To hell with this bouquet, he thought. I'll say that the boy got lost in the crowd or threw the flowers into the water, but for some reason his feet wouldn't go there. It's still only noon. Ahead awaits a feast. Congratulations, gifts, dancing. Frankly speaking, this holiday of life bored him very much. Andrew looked in the direction of the street, where the thief had run away, and after thinking for a couple of seconds, he hurried after him again. The boy turned into the courtyard, slowed down to catch his breath, and wandered past the houses. At one of the playgrounds, he was called by the boys. "Look, here comes Andrew." "Hey, why are you alone? And without your grandmother?" mockingly asked a tall guy sitting on a small rusty merry-go-round. The other boys laughed. "Leave me alone," muttered the boy and walked quickly past with his head down. "What have you got there, flowers? Give them to me." "I'll give them to Susie." The boy stood up and followed. The boy ran away, apparently afraid that the stolen bouquet would be taken away. What the hell is going on here? Andrew was puzzled as he watched the scene, and seeing that the boys had already approached the boy, he hurried towards them. He called out to the group. The hooligans looked round. "Can't you buy flowers for a girl? You just have to hit on the kid." "None of your business." The boy took offense. Andrew followed the boy, who managed to slip away and headed further into the courtyards behind the high-rise building to a small stone house. Judging by the windows, there were 2 or 3 flats on the first floor. Here the bridegroom, for the second time, thought that it was necessary to return. Well, the street kid stole the bouquet. Maybe he wants to sell it or give it to the grandmother, who had just been mentioned by the kids on the playground. It's a simple matter of going to the nearest florist and buying something acceptable. Caroline and her guests are probably already fidgeting, not realizing where he's gone, and as luck would have it, the phone was left in the car. "We have to leave for the restaurant in 20 minutes, but something was still keeping me from turning round and heading back. Better call a taxi right away." But interest took over. Had he run across the street to get here for nothing? Andrew in his fancy suit looked strange and unnatural amidst the poverty and ruin that surrounded him. Strange. He'd run through these parts a few times, but he didn't even know what these old courtyards harbored. The walls of the house had crumbled away. A large black spot gaped under the roof, as if something had hit the surface hard, but hadn't made a hole, only exposed the insides. Several of the windows were missing panes. Behind them one could see empty rooms with peeling wallpaper. The porch steps were nearly collapsed. The wooden door hung on a single hinge. Inside the building, Andrew was surrounded by the smell of a long unventilated cellar, damp and musty. Shabby green walls, dirty staircases. The house seemed abandoned and living out its last days. A voice was heard upstairs. Andrew headed there cautiously, stepping slowly, afraid of falling through. "Why did you steal the bouquet?" he asked. The voice sounded strange amidst the silence. Andrew entered the flat, and the first thing that caught his eye was the old woman sitting by the window and the boy hiding in the corner behind a huge cupboard. "I'll give it to my mom," he answered timidly, not expecting a chase. The thief was frightened when his grandmother told him that a man had come for him. "I'll dry the roses and give them to her when she comes back." Andrew looked at the woman. She guessed the question. "She's in the colony," the woman answered indifferently. "And this is my grandson, Andrew. Why are you taking someone else's? Give me back the flowers." She turned to the boy, and he looked at the guest in confusion, who at that moment was less interested in the ill-fated bouquet. He went to the shelf and looked at the photograph. "Is this your daughter?" he asked in surprise. "Yes," she answered indifferently, as if being in a stranger's house did not embarrass her at all. "And she is the one who is now in the colony?" Andrew continued, puzzled. "You're getting married today, aren't you?" asked the landlady. "A wedding." The groom thought about it for half a minute. "Oh yes, a wedding. What happened to Iris? Did something happen at work?" "She was framed," I guess the woman said reluctantly. "We didn't have money for a lawyer, and the boss was very important." The woman and her grandson watched the strange stranger, who stepped back to the door, confused. Then he turned round, mumbled something, looked at the boy, which made him frightened again, and clutched the bouquet more tightly to his chest. "Andrew, give the flowers back, I beg you. We'll pick lilacs later when we go to meet her," interrupted the awkward moment. "No, leave them." The guest got upset. "How old are you?" "6, answered the boy timidly. "I see." Andrew replied hurriedly. Deciding to think about it later, I have to go now. But can I come back? The grandmother and grandson looked at each other. Did you know her? The woman asked, waving at the framed photograph. Andrew nodded back. Come on in, we're almost always here. Andrew won't be going to school until next year. The journey back took no more than 4 minutes. Sitting in the taxi, Andrew couldn't see any streets or stops. He looked at his own reflection in the side mirror and remembered how he had once stood under the windows of a student dormitory with a huge bouquet of white roses. A small, fragile girl who seemed to him the most beautiful in the world had come out to him. Is it for me? She looked happily at the flowers. Yes, Andrew came to his senses. They stood there under the curious stares from the windows, in the light rain, but they could not part, and then he went to study abroad, and they were lost. Where have you been so long, and where is the bouquet? Caroline interrupted him abruptly. She was seething with indignation. They hadn't finished the photo shoot, but they needed to leave for the restaurant already. The flowers were gone, and he hadn't even thought to buy other ones. The only thing stopping her from making a scene was the faces of the guests around her. The boy ran off and hid somewhere. I haven't found him, her husband answered her absent-mindedly. Are you out of your mind? Caroline hissed with anger. You've been gone for half an hour. Hooah, Caroline. It's all right. Daddy and I will go and get another bouquet. In the meantime, you two go to the restaurant. Her mother tried to calm her down. But why should you miss the gala now? The daughter continued to be upset. It's okay. We won't be long, assured the parents and went to the car. The bride's day was ruined. She had thought of everything so carefully, tried so hard, and now some stupidity had ruined it. All the resentment was directed not at the boy who had stolen the flowers for some reason, but at her husband, who had done such a stupid thing. And now he's standing in front of her with such an indifferent look, as if it's nothing to do with him at all. What's the matter with you? She whispered to him when everyone had dispersed, and the newlyweds were at a separate, beautifully decorated table. I'm fine. You know how I get tired of such events, he lied. At some point the banquet moved from the building to the street, or rather, to the cozy, spacious courtyard of the restaurant. Andrew didn't notice as Caroline changed her dress to a more comfortable outfit. She posed for pictures, smiling naively, hugging her parents and friends. She laughed. She asked for more champagne, but never stopped glancing at her husband. The whole show was played for the guests. A heavy feeling grew inside that something was wrong. Yes, Andrew had allowed himself to tease her about her preparations, and he hadn't taken much initiative, but tonight he was too aloof. Dusk descended on the city. The evening chill had taken hold. The lights came on. The guests scattered around the grounds. Some were chatting at tables, some were dancing. Some were swinging on the big swings. Ahead of them still waited a huge cake, which the newlyweds had to cut together. Then tea, dancing, Bengal lights, and the final joint photos. Caroline stepped away from her mom and dad and looked around absent-mindedly. Andrew was nowhere to be found. Pretending to walk from one guest to another, Caroline tried to figure out where her husband had gone. He was standing on a small terrace overlooking the river, leaning on the parapet. It's beautiful, he said without looking at the girl. The city was glowing below, the red sunset and streetlights reflected in the water. Yes, Caroline answered automatically. Let's go see the guests. He was upset for some reason and looked at her with an annoyed look. So let's go, deciding to deal with it later. Caroline smiled again. The rest of the evening went beautifully. Beautiful music. A gorgeous white and red cake that everyone was smitten with. A spectacular ending to the event. A photo together. But as soon as the guests left, there was silence. The holiday was abruptly switched off. Music sounded. From the half-open window came the noise of the city. but there was a heavy silence between them. Caroline took offense at the incident of the day. Andrew, on the other hand, saw the boy hiding behind the cupboard in front of his eyes. After a week, things got better. Work, everyday life, visits. In the hustle and bustle of everyday life, the thoughts dissipated. Spoiled holiday seemed not so bad now, especially since friends, relatives, and colleagues were satisfied. At the weekend, she had a chance to visit the house that had been on her mind. Caroline decided to organize a meeting with her friends in the countryside in some new fashionable salon. Andrew was happy to approve of the idea. He had about 5 hours to drive to and back from the house. He caught Andrew in the yard trying to ride a small bicycle without pedals. The neighborhood was empty. The playground was overgrown with grass. The paths were cracked, and the wall of a large, unfinished house blocked the place from other yards. Andrew looked around. It was depressing and eerie to see a child in a wasteland of old, dilapidated buildings. He greeted the boy cheerfully. "What's wrong with your bike?" "It's falling apart," he answered shortly and clearly. And then he was shy, apparently having decided that he had said it too boldly. "It's no good," Andrew sighed. "Drop it and let's see what I've brought you." The boy's eyes lit up, but then he remembered his fear again and stood still. "What are you doing? Take the present as soon as you can." "Is it for me forever?" Andrew asked incredulously. "Forever," nodded. "I'll leave it here. I'll go to your grandmother's house." Andrew went into the entrance and watched from the dirty window as the boy hesitated, looked in the direction of the house, and rushed to unseal the box. Inside was a big blue machine with a remote control. If anyone knew what a child who had received no more than a couple of presents in his 6 years felt at that moment, they would understand. It was a real feeling of happiness. Andrew watched the picture in the yard with a satisfied look and went upstairs. Grandma opened the door, inviting him inside. The room felt cleaner. The same wedding bouquet still stood in a vase on the window. "She won't let me throw it away," Granny explained. They met. Her name was Mrs. Mia. She had lived in the house for 40 years, but now it had been declared an emergency and she and her grandson would soon be moving out. But so far there was no news, and they, along with a few neighbors, stayed there. "Of course, I realize that it's getting dangerous here, and Andrew will have to go to school. His classmates will laugh at him for living in a barracks. But I'm so attached to this house in my heart. My husband and I lived here, and Iris was born here," said the woman, looking round the walls that were dear to her heart. "How's she writing?" Andrew took a moment to ask her. "Yes, she sends a letter once a month. We read it together with my grandson, and then we write back." "Who's his father?" "I don't know. Someone looked after my daughter, came with flowers and gifts, but she never told me. And then Andrew turned up when she was locked up, and it was just the two of us." Iris looked noticeably older than her years, and Andrew was very much like his mother. Andrew suddenly pictured her here, standing by the window or dusting the bookshelves. It made his chest feel uncomfortable. "Bah, look," little Andrew said quite contentedly as he entered. He was still shy of the guest, but his joy was overflowing. When he saw the table full of goodies, he became even more animated, and in half an hour there was not a trace of embarrassment left. As he walked out, Andrew felt a cozy warmth spread through his body. Strangely, this old house with its empty windows gaping in the evening light no longer seemed to be a haven for alcoholics and homeless people. Even a place like this, it turned out, could be more pleasant to be in than his stylish flat with its whitewashed ceiling, which still smelled pleasantly new. He patted his hand lightly on his trouser pocket, where a small bag contained a few blonde hairs he had discreetly removed from his comb. Waiting for the test results had taken several agonizing days. The moment he was handed the envelope seemed to turn everything in his life upside down. "Oh, my son, look at that." "Andrew, look." Do you like it?" A voice broke into his musings. Caroline was standing in front of him with an open sketchbook with several kitchen designs in it. What, he asked, uncomprehending. "Look, do you like this one?" The girl pointed her finger at one of the pictures. "I don't care." "Choose it yourself without looking," replied her husband. "You don't care? I don't understand. Andrew, what's going on? Are we living together or what?" Caroline was indignant. "I don't care about the kitchen right now, especially since you're going to do what you like anyway." She snorted resentfully and walked away. Andrew was glad of that, though. He really didn't care about the household chores in the flat or his wife's outfits. He was not ready to discuss the matter with her, imagining her reaction in advance. Traveling to see his son became a regular occurrence, but he did not yet know how to start a conversation about their kinship. In the autumn, Andrew decided to go to the colony to Iris, not even knowing why he would do it or what he would do afterwards. He was determined to find her. According to Mrs. Mia's story, she had another 6 months to serve. The prison building was in a neighboring town. The gray and gloomy red brick building had no windows on the outside and was surrounded by a high stone fence with barbed wire on top. Andrew was let through the checkpoint and escorted to the warden's office. "I was told you were here to see Miss Iris Smith," a stout, older man in uniform asked him. "Yes, may I see her?" "No, unfortunately," the man said. "Why?" Andrew asked confidently, ready to use his money and all his assertiveness, but the answer stunned him. "Well, she died of tuberculosis. She's buried here in our cemetery, but I can't let you in. Only relatives and no non-relatives." That's it. He was talking to himself, sitting on a chair and hearing everything through a veil of confusion and incomprehension. "How did she die?" he said at last. And so the chief said nervously, "Like all people die. So she. And who are you to her?" "She only has a sick mother and a son, I think." "You know so much about prisoners' families," the visitor asked without losing his senses. "Well, I have to. It's my job," he explained with a wave of his hands. But he couldn't tell Mrs. Mia and Andrew what had happened. The boy waited for his mum so much, kept in his locker all the gifts prepared for her in the form of cards, sweets, and dried flowers. It would be cruel to announce her death to him. But withholding it wasn't the best idea either. All in all, this difficult moment had been postponed and postponed. Caroline became nervous, getting worked up over anything, whether it was things left in the wrong place or a missed phone call. Several times her husband was ready to tell her what was going on in his life. But for some reason, each time she started talking about money, fashion, her friends' personal lives, and the desire disappeared. Andrew was completely sure that she wouldn't understand him. Moreover, all this would make her very jealous. Mrs. Mia had been ill for a long time and had already got used to her condition, but now she was not well at all. When Andrew arrived, he found his son at his first-floor neighbor's house. The grandmother was taken to the hospital. When he arrived and entered her room, he immediately noticed how much she had changed. A thin, pale face, trembling hands. The nurse had warned him that the patient was too weak to talk, but seeing how pleased she was, she let him stay and left. "What is it, Mrs. Mia?" Andrew asked affectionately. "I wanted to see my grandson off to first grade, but I guess I won't have time," she said. "You will. You'll make it. Just lie here and get better. Andrew, before I forget, I need to talk to you now before it's too late." "What about?" "I know you're here for a reason." "Yeah, you're right." Andrew wasn't ready for this conversation and was frantically searching for words. "Is he your son?" the woman guessed. "Yes, he is," Andrew sighed. "So well, that's good. Don't leave him, please, when I'm gone." "What are you talking about?" "It'll be all right." "Promise," Mrs. Mia insisted. "I promise," he gave in. They hugged goodbye and Andrew left, determined to return again as soon as work allowed. But that was the last time they would see each other, because a couple of days later, the hospital called with news of his grandmother's death. Little Andrew was confused when he learned that his grandmother was gone. It was the second scariest day of his life after his mom was taken away by uniformed men. He ran back to his room, climbed onto the sofa, and curled up in a corner. His father sat beside him, wondering if he should tell him now about something that should have been done a long time ago. "Andrew, I know how hard this is for you," he began, and heard the boy sobbing softly. "But there's something I have to tell you. Do you understand? I'm not a stranger to you." "I guessed it a long time ago," continued crying. The boy answered. "You did? I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. I was afraid. In case you didn't want to talk to me." Andrew stood up and looked at his father with red, crying eyes. "Can I give you a hug?" Andrew asked. The boy nodded. He hugged his son for the first time and felt him cling tightly to him. He shuddered, breathing deeply, clutching at his father's coat. Something had to be done right away. "I can't take you away right now." Andrew struggled to speak, and then he felt little hands gripping the edges of his clothes tighter. "But it's only temporary. I'll do the paperwork and pick you up right away, okay?" It was unbearably sad to leave him. Of course, it wasn't the paperwork, it was Caroline who had to be prepared. At least the neighbor was a good woman who had known the boy since he was a baby. Andrew involved several lawyers he knew in his case to solve everything as soon as possible and without sending the child to an orphanage. They assured him that the case would be resolved as necessary. There are no other relatives, no one to claim custody, as long as the wife's okay with it. The wife is the hardest part of the case. Talking to Caroline, she got home and went straight to the bathroom to relax after a day of work. Once out, she started her own tradition of a grooming routine, and somewhere between massaging her face and applying cream to her heels, the sky above her head opened up and a terrible thunderclap erupted. "Is that where you keep going? Now I get it. Now I understand everything," she said, pacing around the flat in her dressing gown and a towel on her head. "Caroline, please sit down and calm down. The baby was here long before you and I met." Andrew tried to calm her down. "How could I believe you? How could I? How could I be so stupid? Not to see anything," she continued. It had been a very difficult evening, but it was over. Caroline even outwardly accepted the fact that her husband hadn't cheated on her and had a son, the consequences of his past life. Custody had been arranged. Andrew Jr. came home, was given a large room, and the boy had his own spacious bed, shelves of toys, a modern phone, a whole wardrobe of clothes, and a real new bike with whole pedals and bell for the first time. His former friends from the neighboring yard would never have recognized him. Everything would be fine if it weren't for his stepmother, who disliked the child as soon as he stepped over the threshold of the zoo. Andrew saw it found him a nanny, and Caroline didn't have a single new chore. But when her husband was late, she was alone with his son. "Get out," she would squeamishly address Andrew whenever she found him in the corridor or the kitchen, "and don't touch anything." His father, on the other hand, loved him dearly. He enrolled him in school prep courses, taught him to ride a bike and rollerblade. The boy never told anyone about his stepmother humiliating him every chance she got. One day, Caroline came home from a meeting with a friend, staggered, took off her heels, and threw them away with a loud thud. Hearing the knock, Andrew rushed to his room, having forgotten the sweets on the coffee table in front of the TV. "You bastard, you've been sketching. Clean it up," she shouted, dropping the biscuits to the floor, where they crumbled into small pieces. The The boy didn't react. "Clean it up, or you're out the door," she shouted. "I won't." "You're the one who dropped it," Andrew replied. "Is that any way to talk to me?" "Oh yes, there's no one else to teach you. Your mom's dead." "That's a shame. There'd be somewhere to escort you out of here." The boy ran into the hallway, grabbed his jacket and hat, put on his boots and ran outside. Caroline wasn't going to follow him. She smirked and headed to the bathroom to lie in the warm water. When Andrew returned, he found her asleep in that very same bathtub. Her son was nowhere to be found. "He's so clueless. You can't expect anything good from him. Probably ran off somewhere," Caroline shrugged. It was evening and then night before there was any news of Andrew. The boy decided to drive back to his place. Andrew got on a bus, got the wrong number, and drove out of town. Getting off at one of the stops, he wandered among the streets until he was met by an elderly man in a green suit, similar to those worn by hunters or fishermen. The man sheltered him in his hut on the very outskirts. He began to watch the adverts. His intuition didn't fail him. The child was already wanted. When Andrew entered the wooden cabin, it was warm inside, and the wood in the cooker was crackling quietly. A brown dog's head was visible in a box under the table. Somewhere a radio was working. Andrew was asleep on the sofa, covered by a large jacket. When he saw his daddy, he was very happy, because his childhood imagination had already painted a picture that he had lost him forever. The owner of the house, who looked like a hermit, invited everyone to the table. While they were drinking tea, he told them how he had met the boy and how he had found himself in his hut. "I was walking the dog. I've only recently got a dog, but I still need to walk it. There's no one on the streets." And there he was, Andrew, wandering around. "I told him not to go out at night, and at night, there's no chance of a beast coming out. And he's crying." The owner was a nice, simple man. He used to work in a hospital, but after his wife died, he lost interest in everything and decided to buy himself a cottage to live in peace and quiet. "Well, Andrew, don't run away again." He shook the boy's hand in a mature way, and he shook his head. In his hands, he held a small chubby lump. There were 6 of them sleeping in that box under the table. They had already learned to run and eat on their own. 4 of them were going to be taken away by the residents of the nearest houses in the private sector. The owner decided to keep one for himself, and the last one, the smallest and cutest, it was unknown whether it would survive or not. I found Lucy already pregnant. The vet said to me, "Let's do everything now. There will be no puppies," and I didn't want to. "Let them be born, I'll give them to neighboring houses." And then only one weak one came out. "Comrade, do you want to take him?" "Yes," the boy said confidently. "Well done. You have a good boy," he said to Andrew Sr. When everyone had gone outside, the owner continued, "Ah, my son has no conscience. That's the kind of man he is. And that's not the way his mother and I raised him," continued the hermit. "What colony?" Andrew asked, remembering his recent trip. "It's not far away. And you know what I learnt about him." I was disgusted. "I guess it's a good thing my mother didn't live to see such a disgrace." The hermit shared his worries. Some woman he pretended to be dead and lives with her. He fell in love. They say with no memory. I don't know whether it was of her own free will or not, but I wanted to go to the right place, but I didn't dare. Besides, it's my son. Andrew Jr. was already in the car, stroking the puppy in his lap. He waved goodbye to his rescuer, and he and his father went home. This time the son told everything. Knowing Caroline's temper, Andrew had no doubt that she had indeed bullied the child in his absence. A palato says, and let's forget the story. He tried to resolve the situation. What? The wife was outraged. Do I have to apologize for that? I didn't expect that from you, Andrew. Then you'll have to live apart for a while. "I'll get you a flat," he responded calmly. It was a tactic he'd thought of as he drove around the city streets. Then Caroline's patience ran out. She confronted him about it, accused him of lying. "Traitor," she said, and that she wouldn't stand for it. As she packed her bags, she still hoped her husband would stop her, but it was as if he had been waiting for it. She slammed the door, throwing the shared photos off the shelves and leaving a mess behind. Her parents, who knew nothing about what had been going on in their daughter's family lately, were shocked. From her stories, it seemed that Andrew had cheated on her and then brought a child to the flat in Brooklyn, unknown where he came from his frivolous friend. But little Andrew was doing better than ever. He studied and played, ran around the flat with a puppy, which together with the nanny they organized a special corner. With all their efforts, the little boy had grown stronger and could already go out on his own. Caroline could not calm down. She was sure that her husband was just confused, and her task was to help him. She went to his parents for protection and support. What Mrs. Ann Pete spluttered, "What do you mean you're separated?" The news of her grandson's arrival shocked her. She literally collapsed into her chair. Caroline was pleased that her son had not bothered to explain everything to them, and she could embellish the situation in her own favor. She did not, however, go into the details of her interactions with the boy. The parents did not dare to go to Andrew, but called him to a serious conversation. He realized, of course, how rash it had been to forget about them and to allow Caroline to influence their opinions. But that was of secondary importance now. He kept the phone in his hand, waiting anxiously for news from his lawyer, whom he had instructed to gather information about the warden and try to find out if Iris was really alive. "What on earth are you doing?" asked his mother as soon as he entered the house. "What are you talking about?" Andrew replied, trying to keep a cool face. "Where did that child come from? And why are you hurting Caroline? Kicked her out." "How could you do that?" They'd only just got married. Mrs. Ann Pete talked on, but no one listened. Finally, my father entered the conversation. "Don't embarrass us, Andrew. You're acting weird." Parents, please calm down, smiled at them. "I'm not acting weird. Yes, you have a grandson. This is Iris's son." When Mrs. Ann Pete heard the name, she was speechless and almost cried. Her husband stopped talking and went into his study. The phone rang and Andrew, seeing the lawyer's name, quickly said goodbye and ran out of the house. He was not in the mood for detailed explanations, especially since the news had come overwhelming. She is indeed alive and living with the very uncomplicated man he met in the colony, but not as a prisoner, but rather as a voluntary recluse. They say in the village that they probably have some sort of pact. They say he released her, but on the condition that she would live with him. I don't think she knows she's presumed dead. "Where do they live?" Andrew asked. "So the same place in a village near the colony. He has a big mansion with a fence, an intercom and a guard at the entrance." Alive, alive. It was pounding in my head. She must be freed. A plan came to mind that was completely insane, but if it came to fruition, Andrew would see Iris. Bribing the local janitor was a simple matter. He'd never seen so much money in his entire life, and it was a simple matter of saying he was ill and going into hospital for a long period of time. Then it was more complicated. One snowy day, the house of the chief of the colony received a phone call. The guard let a vagrant wrapped in rags inside. He wanted to apply for a job with accommodation. Judging by the condition of the yard, through which narrow paths were trampled, a worker was really needed there. "Do you have a passport?" the owner of the mansion asked sharply. "Yes," calmly replied the visitor and took out fake documents. "Give it here. Here is your place. Now live there. There's also a shovel and other tools." Andrew went to work, happy with his own good fortune. He was given a room in a separate house. and no one but the warden of the colony ever left the master's house. But the next day, when he left for work, a woman's figure appeared in the window. She was watering the flowers on the first floor, and glimpsed downstairs where the new janitor was diligently clearing the grounds. He only had time to stare at her for a second, but his heart beat pleasantly. Someone was there, after all, and that gave him hope of seeing Iris. The next few days were hard. Andrew was starving because there was nowhere to cook, and the only shop sold almost nothing in the way of cooked food. A couple of pies were no good. He asked his employer for a favor, but he was in a bad mood and sent the janitor away. Apparently, he continued to resent him at home, because the morning after he left, a woman wrapped in a shawl came out into the street with a small pot, a plate, and a spoon in her hands. "I know you are hungry," sounded a familiar voice. "Damn hungry," smiled the janitor, dropping the shovel. Iris shuddered and almost dropped everything she had brought from her hands. She glanced fearfully in the direction of the guard's cabin. He was watching something of his own. "You can't tear him away," Andrew reassured her. "Why are you here?" "Why are you here?" Iris asked, equally frightened. "I've come for you. We have to get out of here." "No, Andrew. He's got all the papers." "I don't care about them. We'll make new ones. What's keeping you here?" "Andrew, he made me do it." "I didn't want to, I swear," Iris explained. In the distance, a gate rattled. Iris shuddered. "It's at the neighbors. Don't worry." Andrew, who wanted to run away with her right now, reassured her. "He made sure I had no way out. They threatened to kill me," Iris cried. "Here, have some food." Shoving the pot into his hands, Iris started back towards the door, but Andrew beat her to it. "Don't be afraid of anything. It'll be all right. I promise you." "You, Andrew, I believe you. Do you know how he is, how Mum is? I mean, he's forbidden me to speak to them, only in letters. And now I can't even do that." Her eyes are shining. "They're fine." Her eyes brightened. "He's staying with a nanny for now. I couldn't bear to tell him his mum was dead. He's been thinking about you. He's got a whole carload of presents for you." He chose the right thread to lure the recluse out of her confinement. Memories of her son overrode the fear in which she had to live all the time, and she made up her mind. The main thing now was to get outside the house unnoticed. Someone they knew would be waiting for them there. They decided to do it tomorrow, because today there was no time left before her husband came. He came back, as always, in the evening, but went not to the house, but straight to the janitor. "Are you trying to cheat me?" shouted the man. "What's the matter?" Not expecting such a turn of events, Andrew asked. "What is it?" grinned the man. "He asked me, 'What's the matter?' It's because your father is very interested in why his son is working for me as a pawn for me. He's never been so angry with his parents before. Like this moment, his father has apparently set up surveillance on him. Oh my God, why do they always want to mind their own business?" "Get out," finished his monologue and threw his passport on the table. Andrew couldn't go back, knowing that his Iris was alone there with that bastard. It was hard. It felt like it was all his fault. His mistakes had only made things worse. But already standing under the windows of his house, Andrew knew for sure there was no time to retreat. After all, illegal detention of people is a crime, so he could be put in jail. The main thing was to get close enough without making any more rash decisions. Andrew Jr. met his father with great joy. He was afraid he would lose him again, like his mum and grandmother. A puppy named Charlie was running around. "Why did you name him that?" Andrew Sir asked with a smile. "It's the name of the robot in the cartoon. He is very good and kind," explained his son. As he ran off to the nursery, the nanny came in. "Andrew, I want to warn you. Andrew has been complaining a lot lately about pain somewhere on his left side." Shouldn't we take him to the doctor? We will, Andrew replied thoughtfully. He wanted to spend the whole evening with his son and calm down a little. But the call from the office made him snap out of it and start doing things again. Lately, he had neglected his business, leaving everything to his deputy. What is this? Andrew wondered unpleasantly as he leafed through the paperwork. A huge amount of money had disappeared from the accounts. Only one of his own could have done it. But how long will it take to find out who did it? Employees need to pay their salaries and customers need results. Andrew ran around the office, reprimanding one and another subordinate. He was torn from the impossibility to leave the business for a while, because it would threaten even more problems. Andrew was waiting for him at home, and Iris was waiting for him far away, all alone, not knowing if he would ever get out. Amanda, take him to the children's clinic yourself, please, he asked the nanny. She called back after they'd been to the doctor. They say it's something to do with his heart. They'll tell you more after they've had tests and analyses. It's getting worse by the hour. There were problems on all sides, none of them promising to be solved anytime soon. 2 weeks passed in the most intense tension. The phone stayed on until late at night. Conversations with the pediatric cardiologist, bank representatives, investigators. We were dealing with an illegal diversion of money from the company's accounts. No calls from business partners or Caroline's parents, and that was good, because dealing with her would definitely drain the last of his strength. On the way home, Andrew didn't realize he'd been speeding through a red light. The last thing he remembered was the big black car coming at him from the left and the loud pounding of his heart in his ears. Was that it? The thought flashed through his mind. A momentary thought and a heavy sleep came over him. Andrew had fallen into a coma. The doctors couldn't say anything about how the situation would develop. Maybe we'd have to keep an eye on him, they said. His son brought his drawings, told his father about what he was doing at the preparatory course, and what he was able to teach Charlie. All he'd hear in response was the beeping of the machines. Nanny never took him home. One day he surprised her with an unexpected request. Auntie, let's go and see Charlie's mom. Where does she live? In the woods. How are we going to find her? Well, she has a master. His name is Grandpa Mike. Shall we go? I don't even know how to get there, answered Nanny, thinking how best to talk the boy out of it. I've got the address. Andrew handed her a small piece of paper with the address and phone number he'd got from his grandfather, just in case. It seemed that just such an occasion had presented itself. He missed being close to his mom, and as he shifted his longing to the puppy, he was sure that Charlie missed his mom too. Amanda called the number, and to her surprise, the voice on the phone was very happy and invited them over. After buying dog treats and sweets for tea, they went to look for the mysterious hermit. The puppies had already been sorted out, and now only Mom and son were left in the house. When Charlie saw his own, he ran off to play. Andrew was overjoyed. Let them play, said Grandpa Mike cheerfully, and we'll have tea with honey. After hearing from Nanny about Andrew Sr.'s trip to the colony, the failed attempt to free the boy's mother, she didn't know the details, and the accident that had left his host in a coma, Grandpa Mike thought. When the guests left, he spent the evening pondering what he could do to help. It seemed it was time to act. Even though the perpetrator was his own son, Mike called an old friend who, though retired, probably still had old connections in law enforcement. So he did. The friend contacted the prosecutor's office and urged them to check on the husband. He was not at home for 2 days, but Anna had no doubt that he would return. Although inside there was growing anxiety, some feeling suggested that something had happened. Finally, she could not stand it, went out into the yard and turned to the guard, who was definitely aware of what was happening. He was arrested, he replied indifferently, looking at his clipboard. Arrested how? What for? He didn't have time to answer because a service car appeared on the screen of the external camera. Police officers came to them. After a lot of explanations, examination of papers and correspondence, Iris was released. She took some money from the piggy bank in the hallway to get home. Looking around as if she was afraid of being followed, she reached the bus stop. It felt strange to be going home, even though she had dreamed about it for a very long time. Outside the window, the sky was drearily gray. The snow was falling. Sparse trees whizzed past. She was also sad at heart. Her old life had long ago fallen apart, and would she be able to build something new? When she arrived home, she found her flat empty. Everything was still as it had been. Her mother's shawl on the back of a chair, unfinished knitting, an open book on the table. Her son's old toys were lying on the floor. Her picture was also framed on the shelf. The neighbor was already packing her bags. She was due to be given the keys to her new flat the other day. She hugged Iris, who could barely stand on her feet. "You don't have time for this, of course, but go to the administration office. This flat is yours now. They should give you a new place too. It's all under demolition," they said, the woman advised. Iris didn't care about housing. She just wanted to die in this flat, to freeze. Lying on the sofa and clutching a teddy bunny to her chest, all that was left of her childhood. "Get up," her neighbor came in the next day with the kettle and buns. "Your son is waiting for you. You have to live. It's too soon to give up." Iris had no idea how to find him. She didn't know Andrew's address. She had no phone, no money. Who could she turn to? "I have his number. Let's call him," her neighbor prompted, and after a minute she gave Iris excited looks to see if anyone was tied in. Nanny Amanda had become the only person responsible for Andrew. There had been no word from his parents or Caroline since the accident. Even more so, the boy wasn't interested. When he saw his mum, he couldn't understand what was going on. The face was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She smiled, and then everything came back to normal. "Mum," he smiled back. She walked over to her son and hugged him tightly. He had grown, matured, but his hair was still sticking out in all directions. He had a car in his hands and funny slippers in the shape of dogs on his feet. Iris was finally able to go out and feel like a free person who belonged to herself. Andrew took care of her, handed her all the presents he had prepared, showed her where everything was. He bragged that he had managed to teach Charlie some simple commands. "Sit," he said to the dog, and he waved his tail like a propeller and happily obeyed, for which he received a few pellets of food. "Mum, shall we go to Dad's?" he asked the day after her arrival. "Come on," she replied and blushed, realizing that she had to say something. To explain her silence of many years, "Have you made friends with him?" "Yes," said the boy with pleasure, munching colored sweets and accidentally putting a pellet of food in his mouth. They both laughed. Iris exhaled. Everything here had resolved itself, and her son wasn't mad at her. Before going to see Andrew, they stopped by the clinic where her son was seen. The doctor was genuinely pleased to hear that his little patient had his mother back. Lately, he had always been accompanied by a nanny, which suggested that his parents didn't take much care of him. "Your Andrew has a heart defect, but don't worry. According to our observations, it should close on its own. We're already seeing improvement. Based on the latest tests, we'll continue to monitor it. In the meantime, let him enjoy life, eat a full diet, and get plenty of sleep. I've written out the rations and given them to the nanny." Andrew, who was sitting on a bench in the corridor, looked at his mum and asked quietly, "Mum, I'm not going to die like Grandma." "No, of course you won't. You're just a little boy. And only very, very old people die," she answered as cheerfully as possible with a heavy feeling in her throat. "And Daddy? Will he wake up soon too?" "Yes," you see, the son cheered up, and on the way to the hospital he kept talking. He talked about the teacher who taught preparatory classes on Saturdays, about his future classmates, cartoons, and New Year presents the newbie ethics. He became quiet only in the ward where his father was still lying. Blue walls, white bed linen, red lights of devices. In the silence of the hospital, everything seemed bright and unchanging, as if nothing could change. The young doctor they had seen first had reported reassuringly that the patient's condition had improved, though he had not regained consciousness. Today, the nurse noticed that he moved his arm and made a quiet sound. Let's not give up hope. Talk to him. Medicine is medicine, but sometimes miracles happen. Mother and son looked at each other. Iris smiled. Andrew shrank back. Hospitals had always frightened him. Now, sitting in the room next to Andrew Sr., they were silent. Iris was the first to break the silence. Well, Andrew, here we are. I don't know what you'd say now, but I think you'd be glad. What do you think, Andrew? The boy shook his head. If only Charlie could be brought here. He misses me too. Oh, why don't we ask the doctor if he'll let us, Iris suggested. Seeing her son sigh, she changed the subject. Shouldn't we bring something tasty? The smell of pies might wake him up. Oh, yes it would, came a husky man's voice. Daddy, Andrew Jr. exclaimed excitedly. Iris was confused. She didn't know what to do or say. The moment was so welcome, yet so unexpected, that it was absolutely confusing. How are you? She asked, leaning towards him. I'll get the doctor. Wait, Andrew Sr. wheezed. I want to look at you. He lay on the bed, painfully pale, with half-closed eyes, but happy. On their way back, they bumped into Caroline in the corridor. She recognized Andrew Jr. and looked angrily at Iris. There she was, the cause of all her troubles. You're not going to make it, she hissed, stepping forward and beating the rhythm loudly with her huge heels. She doesn't love me, the boy explained, skipping down the path on his way home. I even ran away from her into the woods. Andrew Sr. was on the mend. Iris and her son visited him almost every day. The day Caroline confidently got to him, they had a difficult conversation, culminating in the decision to file for divorce. As soon as Andrew was discharged from the hospital, lying already at home on his bed, he began to sort out the affairs of the business. Contrary to his worst expectations, the company did not go bankrupt, and one of the employees was eventually caught cheating and fired. The money, of course, still had to be recovered, which was very difficult, but at least there were to be no new leaks, and no one from the team quit. The work continued. Iris stayed living in Andrew's flat. He saw her every day while cooking dinner or playing with his son. He became more and more convinced that he had never loved anyone more than this small, fragile, but so strong woman. She still suffered from her past. She often cried when she remembered her mom. She didn't know how to move on. But Andrew didn't remind or reproach her, and that made her feel better. One day, when he was still lying on the bed, the bell rang. The guests had arrived. She greeted them, let them inside. When Mrs. Ann Pete entered the room, she noticed at once that her son was well looked after. The flat was clean, with a mug of hot cocoa, homemade pastries, and fruit on the nightstand. He was just tasting the treats when his parents appeared at the door. His father looked as if he'd been brought in by force. His mother looked genuinely pleased. The last time they'd seen Andrew was when they'd come to the hospital, but he hadn't woken up yet. Son, let's make peace, Mrs. Ann Pete said, sitting down beside him. Are we really like enemies? Yes, Dad said. Well, you two talk and I'll be off. I have something to do. The mother went out and closed the door behind her. Father and son, left alone, began a difficult conversation about the past. For the first time in many years, they seemed to have a sincere understanding, though it was still far from ideal. Mrs. Ann Pete returned to the hallway. picked up the large bag she had left there and knocked on the door to the nursery. Iris and Andrew Jr. were sitting on the floor, putting together a tower of cubes. She was startled, but didn't show it and got to her feet. The boy looked confused at his mum, then at his grandmother, and continued to sit. "Is your name Iris? And you, Andrew?" the woman asked politely, and the two nodded their heads in response. "Would you like some tea?" Iris suggested, seeing her guest's genuine embarrassment. "That would be a pleasure." Mrs. Ann Pete was delighted. While they drank tea in the kitchen, Andrew showed his grandmother's presents and rejoiced at the addition of new cars. He has generally got so many more toys lately than he could ever have dreamed of before. Andrew's mother was a gossipy gossip, but she was still kind, sympathetic, and wanted to live in peace. Iris, for her part, held no grudge against them for not allowing them to meet years ago. The grandfather did not dare to come to his grandson, but just stood in the doorway and even smiled, seeing how happy his wife was listening to his grandson's stories. And Iris was pleased that her son was communicating so freely with his grandmother. He seemed to be surprised at this, because he was occasionally embarrassed. When Andrew finally got back on his feet, he did not hesitate to propose to Iris so that she would no longer feel insecure. Plus, he's determined to bring up her old cases and get to the bottom of everything to refute the unfair accusation. Once that happened, she could, if she wanted to, get a good job. As she got used to her new life, Iris blossomed. Her former cheerfulness and lightness returned to her, and her husband was delighted to see his great love reappear before him.
Marian Morris had long since stopped being dreamy. She had a lot to worry about in this life. Not long ago, her father had left the family, leaving his wife with an invalid mother and 3 minor children alone. The 19-year-old girl was the main helper in this family. Sometimes it even seemed that she had become a substitute for her father. The mother had a quiet, calm character, but she was never affectionate and attentive to her relatives. Especially her indifference lately extended to the elder Marian, whom she more often called Mary, and treated her as if she were a neighbor's girl. Mrs. Kimberly, a mother of many children, had another son aged 11 called Jack and a very young daughter, a preschooler named Cassandra. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Marian was not with Marcus, Kimberly's ex-husband, but with some longtime pal of the woman. Most likely a drinking buddy, she liked to get down to the bottle, just like her husband. But then one day, Marcus had an irreparable event. He suddenly had an epiphany, became more and more interested in newfangled trends for a healthy lifestyle, and attempted various diets. First, Marcus gave up his family's favorite sausage sandwiches in the morning, then all meat dishes. Kimberly began to buy more fish, which her husband had not yet given up, but this did not save their marriage. Marcus then became a raw food eater, and then starved. More and more often, instead of having a glass or two with his wife and friends, he started to go to the forest, walk there for several hours, and just enjoy nature. He found adherents on social networks. Almost all of them were men and unmarried. It was interesting for the aspiring vegan to observe the lifestyle of these freedom-loving guys through photos and videos on the internet. And increasingly he was disappearing outside the house, away from his family, his children, his wife, and his sick mother-in-law, with whom his relationship never worked out. I felt life. I had to change something in my destiny. He shared these sentiments with his friends more and more often. And then one day, lying on the sofa after another inspiring walk, Marcus looked at his wife and fussing children and realized he had to leave. As Marcus packed his things, Kimberly just lay motionless in the room. Sometimes it seemed like she was sobbing, but she had found out about her husband's decision a couple of days before he left, had an argument with him, even a bit of a fight, and then just realized there was nothing she could do about it. Marcus put his arm around his son and kissed the still uncomprehending Cassandra, who had been asking him all the way, "Dad, when are you coming?" And her question remained unanswered every time. Then the prodigal father, ready to leave the house with his bags, where a taxi was waiting for him in the street, looked at Marian, who was standing aside. He approached her slowly and said, "Marian, look for yourself." The girl looked at him questioningly. "Look for yourself. Look inside, you have a light." You're going to make it." "Okay," the daughter answered confusedly. This large family was left alone, without a father, without a breadwinner, without a protector. Now both mother, grandmother, and Marian, as the oldest members of the family, began to think more and more often about how to feed the children. Marian had felt lonely almost from childhood. She had friends, some of her classmates stayed in town. Most of them had moved to places more suitable for earning and living. One such friend was Gabrielle Jones. She had known Marian since first grade. They both sat in the fan seats at the outdoor stadium, where town sporting events were often held. Marian decided to tell her friend about the recent changes in their family. "So anyway, my dad left my family." "Really?" Gabrielle put both hands on her head, trying to act dramatic. "Yeah, he just left. Packed his things, said goodbye, said some rubbish to me." "What kind of stuff?" "Yeah, it was bullshit." Marian smirked. "Look for the fire inside," said the girl. Gabrielle laughed out loud, followed by the storyteller. They were both rolling on the floor with laughter. But then, calmed down, Marian went on again. "Yes, he's been strange lately. To tell you the truth, I didn't feel sorry for him." "Strange? What do you mean?" "Going into the woods, not eating meat, and all that." "Yeah." And anyway, Marian looked away and smiled faintly. She took out a packet of cigarettes. "What?" "What? Say what you want to say." "I don't even know." It was obvious that Marian hesitated to tell her, or to keep secret what lurked in her soul. She didn't know whether to tell even her best and time-honored friend at such moments. "Marian, we've known each other so long. Maybe I'm worried." Gabrielle bought her friend a smoke and she gave in. "Yeah, they say he's not my father. I don't know whether to believe it or not." "That's weird, who's saying that?" "Mrs. Cheryl from up the street, Mom and Dad's friends. I haven't heard it myself, but it's all come to me recently. It's so annoying to be told you've heard it somewhere. I mean, everyone's talking about it now." "Yes," said Gabrielle thoughtfully. All evening and all night, Marian worried about her decision to tell her friend about the rumor, for even she did not know if it was true. Marian had worked before her father and family left, but it was more of a part-time job than a full-time job. She handed out leaflets. She was a sales consultant in a clothing shop. She traveled with goods to various addresses in the city as a courier. Now it had been decided by the family council that Marian would go to New York to work. Kimberly had already managed to call her sister, who worked in one of the grocery shops of a large chain in the city. Catherine was a receptionist and had once long ago offered Kimberly a job at an open sales position. Kimberly had been taking care of the younger Cassandra at the time, and Marian couldn't sit with her since she was already moonlighting somewhere. When Marcus left, she remembered her sister's offer. It was Marian's first day of work. She was to come to the shop and talk to Mrs. Catherine and listen to a short lecture on her job description. Marian took her packing seriously. She put on dark trousers and her best, almost unworn jumper. Her mother saw her fiddling in the mirror and putting on her makeup. "Why are you going to be a shop assistant?" she said squeamishly and almost indifferently, standing on the threshold of her daughter's room. Marian made no reply. She had long ago reduced her intercourse with her mother to a minimum and spoke to her only on business. She loved her, of course, but it was easier this way. Marian had long felt that her mother's attitude to her was mainly consumerist, and she did not want to be personally convinced of it. This woman seldom cared for the girl's personal problems. Her name had long been associated in this family with the words, help, do, and fetch. It was a long drive from small town to big New York City, where Marian had only been a couple of times in her entire 19-year-old life. She was riding on the bus and listening to her favorite music on the player, looking around at the surrounding farms and small towns along the way. Suddenly, she felt sad. The girl thought about her life in her childhood. "It turns out I hardly had one." She remembered quite the early years when there were 3 of them. Her mother and father. They had been younger, funnier, and friendlier then. Her mother would hug her at times, kiss her forehead, and her father would joke merrily, tossing his little girl in the air. Father and mother drank less. They were lively, but then brother Jack was born, and relations in the family, for some reason, deteriorated. Marian was only 8, and she already had to almost run from school to sit with the baby. From then on, the girl began to feel that she was no longer perceived as before, as a daughter, as a girl, as a living person who had a beating heart inside. More and more often she began to hear, "You must, don't forget," and other words containing requests, if not orders. And less often she received words of approval, care, and love. When Cassandra was born, Marian realized that she was certainly not going to have a carefree life now, and she was right. Jack went to school, and Kimberly had her third child. Marcus began drinking more and participating less in the family's life. His wife, who had many children, soon had to look for work, as he quit his job and started looking for work himself. These searches were passive, and every time he was asked about his progress, he sadly replied that there were no suitable vacancies yet, that the salary at the interview was lower than the stated salary. There were many other reasons why he couldn't get a job at his working age, being a fit and healthy man. Kimberly understood that he had no desire to get up every weekday from his favorite sofa and deny himself daily drinks with friends and watching humorous TV shows and series about the police. But what was to be done? Her husband's temper was sometimes harsh, and he could, even when he was in a depressed mood, use his hands, but not against the children. All in all, Kimberly knew she shouldn't have disturbed him. She had also hoped that he would be involved with the kids, but that wasn't happening either. You did your homework and clean up after yourself. That was usually the extent of her father's attention. During this period, Kimberly began to look more and more closely at her eldest. She was already 14 years old when Cassandra was born. One day she told the girl bluntly, "I'm working, money is tight. You need to get a job too." Marian was a serious child, and after a month she started bringing in a small income for the family. She barely had enough for her own needs. She gave almost everything to her mother. Once Marian dared to ask her why her father did nothing, and then she regretted it for a long time. So many negative words and emotions in her direction she had never heard before, became very offended. And at that moment, everything changed in her soul. If her mother did not become her enemy, then her attitude to her, seemingly to the most dear person, became indifferent. Soon Kimberly noticed this change in her daughter, and instead of discussing with her the reason for her reticence, she began to respond in the same way. They were both bound together only by their concern for Jack and Cassandra. Marian became a second mother to these children. Kimberly was not only absent from work, sometimes she arrived very late, and no one knew what the real reason for her delays was. The sick grandmother was out of the picture in this family, and in that she and Marian were alike. She lay in her room and occasionally chatted with her grandchildren. There were medicines lying everywhere, and there was almost always a television on. Marian liked to share some of her less than obvious experiences with her, but as time went on, her grandmother began to feel worse and worse. She was in the hospital or just sleeping. Her grandchildren visited her less and less. On her face one day appeared an expression of indifference to life. All these moments of her life replayed in her head mysterious black-browed girls sitting on the last row in the bus, and sometimes her eyes filled with tears. Well, at least we'll have more money, so she comforted herself at the end of her heavy thoughts. Soon the announcement was made. New York terminus. Marian sighed. She wanted to ride in this old bus, to look at the trees at home and just think, dreaming of a better life that might never come. Marian got off the bus and slowly made her way towards the city center. The stop was located on the very outskirts of town. She saw a few older houses. They were located on an elevated area. The further she traveled towards the shop, the more modern scenery she encountered. Finally, she saw a large grocery shop. It was beautiful, all glass and with glowing letters on the roof. It was a very huge building. Marian walked inside the premises. There was an escalator running right in front of the entrance. On the ground floor, there were little stalls with balloons, with unusual lollipops and different bling. And all this colorful picture briefly caught the eye of a girl from a small town, who did not often come to such crowded places. First, she wanted to buy a beautiful knitted bracelet with stones. Then she looked long and fascinated at the golden statue of a dragon. "I'd like to take one of these home," Marian dreamed. After about 10 minutes of excitement, she remembered that she had not come to go shopping, but to get a job in a grocery shop. But where was it? So it's a shopping center, I guess, she thought. The signs said the grocery shop was on the first floor. At the shop, Aunt Catherine met her niece and immediately started telling her about the duties. There were a lot of them, and one had to listen carefully. Marian knew that Catherine didn't like to repeat herself and took her personality very seriously. Perhaps that was why she and Kimberly didn't get along very well. Her sister in conversation could take offense at nothing, but seriously. Marian was issued a uniform. She was assigned a mentor, a petite blonde woman of about 45 named Selena. She spoke quietly and quickly, sometimes even slurring her words. The girl's first day as a trainee was hectic but unnoticeable. With her anxious thoughts and running after Selena, Marian didn't notice how her shift ended. 9 p.m. You can pack up. Her mentor walked up to her. What about you? Me too. Let's go to the back room and change there. Did I work well? Marian asked. Yes, you've been fine. It's hard to tell from the first day. Marian calmed down. For some reason, she thought she had made a lot of obvious mistakes, but it turned out that her mentor did not notice anything, or considered all her faults as insignificant. Either way, she was glad for the end of the day, even though no one had praised her. The main thing was that she hadn't messed anything up. So a month passed and Marian received her first salary, as well as her new position as a sales consultant. The probationary period past this event was the main success she had had recently. One day she came home and found her mother at home, peacefully making soup in the kitchen. Suddenly, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to share her achievement at work with her. She went into the kitchen, and she and her mother exchanged a few words. No, I won't, Marian thought. She's all about the money, and that's all that matters. Soon Marian had established herself in her position at the shop. She did her job splendidly and had no complaints about life. She was given a pay rise and once even made Employee of the Month. She was now used to sharing her successes only with herself. Her friend Gabrielle got married and moved in with her husband in Chicago. At times Marian thought of her and even envied her happiness a little. Yet on the whole, she was content with what she had. The girl had become truly independent. And it was not only about financial independence, because now she could afford to spend more on herself. In addition to all this, she changed personally. She didn't need company at all. She didn't want to talk or listen to anyone. She worked and helped her mother with her children. It would seem that what else was needed for her? A person who had long been deprived of any ambitions. And yet she wanted to love. Marian tried to get into relationships with guys, but after a few short attempts she realized that she didn't want to be with just anyone to have fun and arrange romantic evenings. All these young people were not in a hurry to be serious about Marian. You're a little too outspoken. Gabrielle had hinted to her in the days when they still lived in the same town. You're a bit, I'm sorry, not feminine, are you? She once said. Marian tried to hide the feeling of offense, but she had a great complex in her heart. She was indeed a little coarse, her voice was low, her features, though beautiful, were in many ways boyish, her nose with a hump, her slightly extended manly lower jaw, and her eyes, those brown, thoughtful eyes, in which something deep, secret, and serious was read. It had been 2 years since Marian had taken a job with Aunt Catherine. She was 21 years old and in love. Stephen Howard worked as an area manager for a shopping center and occasionally went into the shop to check on the quality of the staff. He took a fancy to an unusual black-browed girl, and she took a fancy to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His expression always conveyed good-naturedness, and the high-browed, bony blonde named Stephen was liked by all the cashiers and saleswomen in the shop, and they were not shy about exchanging a few enthusiastic words among themselves after he left. Stephen had come on board later than Marian had started working here. For 6 months they exchanged glances, but one day Stephen did get bold enough to make the first move. She was standing at the meat counter. The shop was unusually small and the clerk had nothing to do. It was the right moment for the two of them. She heard behind her, "Girl, why are we standing there? Why are we not working?" It was funny that Marian, who was tired of working days from domestic cares with her brother and sister, at first reacted to the manager's remark sharply and negatively. She turned round and stared at the man with her deep and intense gaze, squinting her thick, dark eyebrows. "I work when there's work to be done. Are all the shelves filled with merchandise? Customers don't need counseling? Is the warehouse in order?" In a monotonous and slightly raised tone, Stephen bombarded the young saleswoman with work-related questions. She stood in silence for a few seconds, not taking her stern gaze off the man, of course, realizing that she would be in trouble if she continued to be rude. It was obvious that she was facing a representative of the management. However, being in a bad mood and hurt by the phrase about idleness in her address, as well as unpleasant questions that sounded like complaints, She could not keep her discontent to herself. "I've worked here for 2 years and no one has ever complained about me. If you want to be the first to do so, be my guest." Marian had that unpleasant quality from childhood. She sometimes could not hold back her sudden anger. She'd had a couple of fights at school, the so-called shooters. There were also attacks of uncontrolled aggression, but all these moments were rare because at home reigned complete indifference. And it would be strange to behave in such a way when neither mother nor father even asked you questions about your affairs, not to mention serious conversations about studies, personal life, or smoking, standing in front of a shop management representative. For the first time in years, Marian remembered her peculiarity. Her face was covered with color, her eyes glistened, and in her soul there was both dislike and fear for her position, without which she had not seen a full life for herself and her family for a long time. Everything hung on this fragile girl. Suddenly, the stern expression on Stephen's face changed to one of mortification and contentment. He looked at the name on her badge and said in a good-natured tone, as if afraid of her hurt feelings, "Marian, I don't know your patronymic, but I can see that you are a man of character, and I hope you have a good sense of duty. A man like you should be. I didn't mean to offend you in any way. I am here to make our business grow and become as profitable as possible." Marian made no reply, but felt as if the manager still had something to say. She was not mistaken. And he continued after a short pause. "How do you get on here?" "I can't complain," she mumbled. She wanted to go to the warehouse, but sensing that the beautiful and daring and even more beautiful girl wanted to leave, Stephen decided to act immediately. He had already spent 6 months looking for her casually through the stalls. "Marian, let me give you my number, so you can be my assistant and keep me informed of how things are going in the warehouse." Marian smirked. She had calmed down a bit, and instead of irritation there was curiosity. "What do you want me to do? Rat out my colleagues?" "I'm sorry, doing what?" Stephen smiled just as amiably. "Marian, I'm just collecting employee numbers." "But they're on the database, if anything." The manager was not angry with Marian. On the contrary, he found her a very interesting person, and all her mockery, inappropriate grimaces, like a lack of etiquette when talking to the bosses, only made him angry. He wanted to know more about the girl. "All right, in base, I'll write to you, go to the warehouse." Marian went away. She was filled with one great and vivid feeling. No, it was not anger. It was love at its most embryonic stage, when we are not yet sure of our feelings, and are ashamed of ourselves, ashamed of our thoughts about the person, for we know nothing about him. The same thing was happening to Marian when she just stood in the warehouse by the boxes and did not move, because her new thoughts prevented her from concentrating. "Manager, what did he want from me?" Bullshit. After a peculiar interaction with the new employee, Stephen approached Selena. "Who is this hooligan you have working here?" He smiled at the saleswoman. Selena sighed. "I think she's Mrs. Catherine's niece. That's all I know." "How's the job?" "We're responsible. Not bad, helpful." "All right, thanks, I'll be off." Stephen left the shop in a pleasant thoughtfulness, and afterwards thought for a long time about the young tall brunette with a serious and beautiful look of big brown eyes. For a long time, neither Marian nor Stephen forced themselves to continue this informal chat. Stephen arrived a couple of weeks later. He didn't write or call her as he had promised. After chatting with the manager, the man in love immediately approached Marian and said in a loud voice, "We need to talk. Please go to the warehouse." There were salesgirls and the manager around, still not far away, and the manager did not at all want to be judged by the junior staff here in the future. He was merely pretending that he intended to reprimand the salesgirl. Marian was frightened for a moment, forsook thoughts of the beauty of her lover's eyes and lips, which in a fortnight had bored her, and thought of the dreadful thing, which was the word dismissal. They both walked slowly towards the warehouse. There was no one there, and the only witnesses to Stephen's forthcoming revelations would be the numerous boxes of foodstuffs. "Marian, I'll tell you straight away, no complaints." She looked questioningly at her boss. "I like you here, round and round. I do not want to go round. I want to try to communicate with you." She looked somewhere to the side, down, and smiled sweetly and embarrassedly, as if wanting to answer something. Her lips involuntarily shook, and a slight, but still noticeable to the interlocutor paint, covered all her beautiful face. "Well, you think, here's my number." Marian took from the man a small white card with printed lettering and logo. As he walked away, she examined it. Stephen Howard, business consultant. Below it, in even smaller print, was a list of his services and his phone number, the most important thing for which this business card had been handed to her. It was a beautiful time, spring. It was around this time that Marian and Stephen began dating. They didn't advertise their relationship. The territorial manager came to the shop as usual, a couple of times a month, and communicated only with those with whom he was supposed to communicate by work. He and Marian even tried not to look at each other. One day during a smoke break, Selena brought up Stephen. There were 3 female shop workers standing outside in a circle. They should have finished their smoke break sooner rather than later, as the shop was left to 2 people, one of whom was a young girl who, just like Marian, had come here a couple of years ago and knew next to nothing. Molly, the cashier, put out her cigarette butt on the rubbish bin and, carefully dropping it there, walked off into the building with a quick step. Selena and Marian took quick puffs to finish their cigarettes and go to their seats. "And are Stephen's all right?" Selena, who was not particularly noted for her participation in gossip, replied cryptically. "Who do you mean, Selena?" Marian asked, though she knew it could only be about the manager. "Stephen Howard." "Yeah, he seems nice." "Marian, are you two dating by any chance?" Selena asked, and the question changed the expression on her colleague's face. "No. What makes you think that?" "Well, I don't know, it just seemed like an experience." "I don't know what your experience is. You're paying attention to the wrong things," Marian snorted unfriendly. "Maybe not, but just in case he's just not your best option, it's best not to get involved." Marian didn't say anything back to her. She was surprised by her colleague's words. She didn't understand why Selena started to be frank about her boss, and why she was so sure of their connection. The saleswoman wasn't fooling her, though. She had indeed speculated and just guessed that was what was called experience. The quiet, silent worker, who had never been seen discussing colleagues before, suddenly decided to share her suspicions about Stephen with the young employee. Perhaps Selena recognized Marian as herself, and Stephen resembled someone from her past life. The feelings and thoughts that had prompted her to talk remained unknown to Marian. Marian had been her own person for a long time, and she made all her own decisions. She didn't rely on anyone, and she didn't count on anyone. Stephen was a ray of sunshine that had suddenly come into her life. He was a real grown man, capable of courtship, gifts, and displays of affection. Marian had never met a man like him before. All the few partners she'd had were boys, not men, and it wasn't even a matter of age. All they could offer was a trip to a cafe and a sleepover at their house when her parents were away. Stephen, on the other hand, was a wealthy man. He was 30 years old and had already been living alone for several years in his own flat, which he had partly earned himself. His parents were honorable, educated people and wished their son a similarly honorable party. They were both university professors, and many of their students seemed to them good candidates for the role of their son's future wife. But Stephen often referred to the busyness at work and did not come to these nice acquaintances, and if he did, all communication ended with a banal gesture of propriety. He walked the student home and wished her good night. It's not like that. Each time Stephen complained to his parents, begging them to stop these useless acquaintances. His father and mother were genuinely perplexed and asked their son what he wanted. And he only answered, "I'm a grown-up uncle. I'll sort it out myself." So what did the 30-year-old territorial manager of a large grocery chain, Stephen Howard, really want? Firstly, the man was somewhat annoyed by any desire of people, even his closest relatives, to dictate his life. He was used to being the king of his life, and only circumstances that happened to us not of our own free will could change his trajectory. No one in this world was an authority to him, only himself. Some of Stephen's acquaintances called his characteristic overconfidence, and more than once he was advised to listen to the opinions of others, and yet he did things his own way. When he succeeded in his career, he clearly realized that he was on the right path. Strangely enough, he had no clear goal in matters personal. Stephen did not strive, as his parents put it, to find a worthy party, although he was already 30. Perhaps romance lived in this purposeful and pragmatic man. There wasn't much of it, but he, just like his new love Marian, believed that you just had to find your man. It didn't matter to him that his girlfriend hadn't accomplished much in life and worked at the grocery shop in the lowest position. He liked her dark, always, as if on something focused eyes and rough, but at the same time so beautiful and attractive features of the face. Yes, he felt in this difficult, silent girl his own man. Marian had almost ceased to sleep at home. Her mother, of course, was not happy with her, although now their financial situation had improved markedly, and her daughter threw a certain amount of money into her account every month. Since Marian began to date Stephen, the amount became even greater. It was because the young man was giving her money for personal expenses, which meant that the mother was now allowed to throw even more money. Marian understood and didn't argue with her when she spoke. "You have decided to pay us off," she replied. "Yes, you may consider it so," and went to work and then to Stephen's house for the night. Stephen was in no hurry to offer to move Marian into his flat. What was it he couldn't exactly figure it out himself? Perhaps it was some insecurity about his feelings. Or maybe, despite his independence, he was still afraid of his honorable parents and ashamed of the 22-year-old shop assistant who had been his girlfriend for 6 months. In any case, after some time in the soul of this successful man, there was a certain dissonance. He as if began to slowly retreat back. 6 months later came the crisis in this unequal relationship. Marian, tired and broken, came home more and more often to spend the night. Stephen looked for all sorts of excuses not to invite her over. Her mother smirked one day when she saw her daughter on the doorstep late at night. "What, did he leave you?" Marian answered her nothing, by the way. She did not tell her a word about her young man. And so several months passed. Both did not know what to do to end this relationship once and for all, or to continue to meet in the same format, but experienced constant psychological discomfort. They arranged a warm meeting on Valentine's Day. It was a chance to set the record straight, to forgive each other for offenses and deal with misunderstandings and understatements. As luck would have it, Marian got some unpleasant news. One of the saleswomen was sick, and there was no one to work the night shift. "Marian, but I'm begging you to come out. You'll be well paid." The manager begged her. "But I have plans for tonight." Marian replied grudgingly. Probably if the manager had known with whom Marian was going to spend the evenings then, she would certainly have looked for someone else. "I'm begging you. I'll get on my knees." "All right, Bridget, don't. I'll go out." A sense of responsibility had been instilled in her from childhood, not by her mother, not by her father, but by life. And Marian couldn't refuse to help the shop she'd been working in for over a year. Still at the end of her shift, she kept walking around, twisting and turning the phone in her hands, typing and deleting text again. For some reason it seemed to the girl that if she didn't make it, her and Stephen's relationship would be over forever. Yes, she had become a little dependent on him. She liked his advances, the fact that he was a wealthy and mature man, but most importantly, having had no experience of a really serious relationship with men before, Marian quickly got used to him. Somehow she thought that this choice was the best, and she would never get another chance to find a suitable life partner. Stephen was indeed good-looking and well-to-do, but did he love her? She didn't want to think about it, because somewhere in the back of her mind, her heart felt unreciprocated. Finally, it was 9 p.m. The second shift had begun. Marian knew she had to be at Stephen's at 9:30 p.m. She had to dare to text. "I'll write it as it is. He'll think I'm responsible. He's the boss here," Marian tried to reassure herself. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen. One new message. It was Stephen. What was he trying to tell her? Marian opened the message. "Sunshine, please forgive me. I can't make it today. I'll be in an important meeting." How easy and convenient it is, being a member of the administration, to refer to important, usually unscheduled meetings. Stephen had used his position more than once to make up another story about these very important matters, but Marian had no choice but to believe him. After all, if there was no trust, then why keep in touch with the man? She wrote him that she was also busy, that she was put on the night shift, using the warmest and sweetest words. Stephen felt sorry for his girlfriend and wished her a brisk shift. Almost 3 hours passed. There were less and less people in the shop, and thus less work too. Marian was thinking more about her personal problems than about customer requests and groceries. It was unusual for her to work after 9 o'clock, and she was beginning to feel a little drowsy. There was a sudden appearance. Scarlett appeared in the shop, the same sickly shop assistant. Marian was a little puzzled. What was she to do now? "Marian, hi. It's okay, I can do it. I'm free," the woman said. "Yes, but Bridget." I rang. Marian shrugged. She went to the back room to change. She hated to humiliate herself in front of Stephen, but his flat was the only place close to the shop where she could spend the night. She realized he had no intention of seeing her. He might already be asleep or out of the house, but it was still better than catching a taxi in a foreign city past midnight. Maybe he'll at least pay for my taxi, she thought. As it happened, Marian had hardly any money with her, and she certainly wouldn't have enough for the ride home. After 3 messages asking for a bed for the night, or at least for help, Marian began to call Stephen, but all her efforts were in vain. He must have been very busy. She stepped outside, breathed the fresh February air into her chest, and headed for the bus stop. There are times when you know you're doing something reckless, but you walk on, as if you're too lazy to stop, think, and make another, more difficult decision. That's what happened to Marian, who all in her thoughts walked slowly to the bus stop, knowing that all the buses had long since gone away. Marian sat down on the bench once more, checking her phone just in case. It hadn't received a single call, not a single message. Of course, she could have called one of her friends and mates, asked to borrow money and hail a taxi. She could have gone back to the shop and spent the night in the back, but her eyes fell on the very few old houses she had noticed the first time she had come here for a job interview. The houses were old and shabby, but still people lived there. Marian was sure that on the ranch there would be some old man or woman who would be kind enough to shelter her till morning and give her a good meal. At least that's what fairy tales and good films and serials about lost people teach us. She walked towards the houses. A window was burning in one of them. Without thinking long, Marian headed towards the light. She approached the wicket, in the yard of the property through the darkness. The girl saw a large foreign car that looked like an SUV. Though the wicket was closed, the hook could be easily lifted from outside the lot. Marian decided to go in to knock on the door. She reckoned that was what the locals here did. Slowly moving around the lot, she got a little look at the property. There was probably a garden under the windows. There were pegs sticking out from under the snowdrifts that looked like the planks of an ornamental fence. There were fruit trees growing close to the fence. She knocked on the door, and a man soon came knocking. "Who's there?" said a tall male voice. "I missed the bus. I don't know what to do." Well, the man said slyly. He sounded elderly. Marian saw before her a skinny old man a little taller than herself, with a long beard and sparse long hair. He was gray-haired. His thin features did not have a particularly aged look. On the contrary, there was something naive, childlike about them. The old man looked at Marian and smiled. He expected to hear her story. "I didn't catch the bus. I don't know what to do." "Aha, aha." The grandfather said fluently, "I heard that. In short, I don't want to beat around the bush. Can I sleep over?" "Sure, come in, come in." Marian at first became frightened. Crossing the threshold of the house, she felt some hostile aura and even wanted to leave. But the old man turned and said good-naturedly, as if sensing that his manners were not to the liking of the uninvited guest, "We have only good people here, and everybody knows me, and I know everybody. Don't worry, girl. Lie down in a small room and rest until morning." The lively interest in his eyes and sly voice dissolved somewhere, and Marian became easier to communicate with this man. She remembered about the foreign car in the yard. "Do you drive?" My son drives. He comes here with his wife. This time he decided to leave it here. I don't know why." Grandpa went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and from the kitchen I heard something. "Do you want something to eat?" "No, thanks." "Well, at least store-bought cakes with tea," replied the guest. While grandfather was fussing in the kitchen, Marian began to look at his home. It was quite decent. There was a plasma TV on the bedside table, and although the furniture was simple and old-looking, the house was clean and tidy. The sofa was populated with a new bedspread of expensive fabric. It seemed as if someone was constantly caring for this dwelling, and judging by the nature of that care, it was hardly the owner. "Yes, my name is Michael Taylor." An elderly man came into the living room with a plate of cakes in his hands. "Marian." The girl sighed tiredly. "Are you sleepy? I'll get some tea." He left again, and Marian felt her heart finally calm down and beat in a familiar rhythm. Marian ate the cakes and drank tea alone, and the master went away again. He came half an hour later and announced that the room was ready. She had gone to spend the night in a strange place, lying in a strange bed, and this moment, of course, embarrassed her. Lying under the covers, she stared at the burning screen of her phone. Such a strange thing was happening to her. She wanted to share her impressions with at least someone. But then she realized, who should I write to? And having put the phone on the bedside table, she fell asleep in the sound sleep of a baby. Tired and spiritually distressed for the day, Marian decided to get out of bed as soon as her eyes opened for the first time that morning. Despite Michael Taylor's apparent hospitality and kindness, she felt uncomfortable being in someone else's home. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 5:27 a.m. Getting up at this hour was certainly difficult, but still Marian made an effort on herself. If I pack quickly, I can catch the bus, she thought. Marian sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched, slowly so as not to wake the elderly owner of the house. She tucked her phone and charger into her bag, looked in the small mirror that hung on the wall, and opened the door to the living room as carefully as she could. The landlord was apparently asleep. He was lying on the sofa, covered with a plaid, with his back to the exit. A few steps separated the girl from the exit. She paused. Maybe I should thank him. At least say something. No, I won't make the bus. She turned towards the door and continued her slow step. After a few seconds, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It couldn't be anyone else. Marian turned around. A satisfied Michael Taylor stood in front of her with a sly smile that pushed her away, still last night. It wasn't as if the man had just woken up. It was as if he had been invisibly watching his guest since the moment she awoke. Marian became frightened. She was a truly desperate girl at times, and yet she was the weaker sex. And there was a strange man standing in front of her, and this man was clearly not going to let her go. Michael now seemed stronger, taller, and more confident to her. Were these sensations contrived from fear, or had the master, all the time the girl had been in his possession, been trying to appear feeble, bending and grimacing to make Marian believe he was pitying her? She did not know, but it was urgent to get out of this house and not make a mess of things. Darling, where are you going? And who's going to pay for it? He gave his victim a sly look. Look, I'm going to leave now. I have no money, but I'll pay you back. Now I can. Marian began to dig frantically in her bag to find her purse. She pulled it out and took out several 100 notes. Hisham, the old man chuckled softly. Do you have a phone number? I'll text it to you or your son. Here's 400. Put the money away. Breathing heavily, Michael said. The elderly owner abruptly sat down and began to pull off the girl her dark, tight skirt, which she had decided to wear the day before, as February had been warm and sunny lately. Marian immediately began to struggle with the rascal. She tried for his shoulders to push him away from her, but he pressed himself against her, wrapping his arms around her legs. Marian felt as if she were falling. They lay struggling for a while. Michael slapped Marian on the cheek. Shut up and obey, or you'll get in trouble. I'll say you attacked the old man. Marian didn't expect that this man could be so dangerous and strong. She started to scream, and he immediately put his hand over her mouth. Feeling that he had little strength to completely defeat the girl, Michael began to beat her mercilessly on the face, trying to suppress her will, but he did not know that Marian had in her soul so strong an undisclosed anger that only give the will to show itself and terrible things would happen. This anger was like a sleeping bear that had been teased by people. The more they irritate him, the stronger his desire to tear his offenders, and only the cage separates fools from death. Unfortunately for Michael Taylor, a lusty old man, who thought of raping a girl in unpleasant circumstances in the middle of the night, Marian was a warrior in her 22 years. She herself didn't fully know what she was capable of. The blows to her face had pissed her off, and she no longer saw the lonely old man in front of her as a monster and a murderer. Marian bit into his neck, and he loosened his grip a little and groaned. Still, it wasn't working to break free from his tight embrace. Michael continued to beat his victim. At some point, she felt sick to her stomach and decided that this was the end. She was ready for violence to stay alive. Her skirt was almost off. The scumbag was already fumbling with her underwear. Marian could not stand this nightmare. She suddenly screamed so frantically that Michael was just in a daze and finally let her get free. It seemed to run free, call people for help, but this feeling couldn't stop. It was charged and demanded some sort of outlet. Marian, strangely enough, in defiance of the sense of self-preservation she had had until a few minutes ago, took a sharp step towards the kitchen. From there she picked up the heaviest-looking utensil, a cast iron skillet, and dashed into the room. Before she realized it, Michael was lifting himself up on his hands to get up, but he was still sitting on the floor. He instantly became the victim, not the hunter. Terrified, the old man looked at the furious girl with the frying pan and only had time to open his mouth, probably preparing an exculpatory speech, pitying words to be pitied and spared, but it was not to be. A blow, another blow, and he fell to the floor, sprawled on it senseless. Marian didn't know if her attacker was still alive, but she immediately called an ambulance and the police. She sat at her desk in a small armchair beside the body of her failed rapist and propped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Thoughts of criminal responsibility began to cross her mind. At 16, when she was still at school, she'd been interested in the law for a while. At home, there was a thick book on the shelves called Legislation. At first, Marian just opened and closed it, and then for fun began to learn by heart the names of articles and their numbers. The number 105 came to mind. Would I get 105 or not? Would I have a chance of not going to jail? This is self-defense. Marian was not sure that she would not be given the article for murder, but she was more inclined to manslaughter. In any case, the girl was scared, because in front of her, perhaps there was a corpse of a man and an elderly man, and she was in someone else's house. Marian went to the mirror. Her face was already beginning to show signs of beatings, and that was to her advantage. She calmed down a bit, sat back in her chair, and continued to wait for the police and ambulance. Finally, after half an hour, Marian waited for the one she had been anxiously awaiting. It was still dark outside, and the people of the neighboring houses must have been asleep, but on hearing the noise of the cars, the gawkers hurried out from behind their fences, and there were those who formed a large crowd around Michael Taylor's property. Murdered my granddad, the bastards, thieves, I suppose. He'd been giving up lately. These and many other phrases from the gawkers could be heard by ambulance and police officers. "What happened?" shouted a woman from the crowd. "We're looking into it," replied the paramedic briefly. People wanted the truth. They were eager to know it. They couldn't just leave the place and wait for the first rumors from the most clever neighbors in the area. Michael Taylor was generally well regarded by the people, though he had not lived here long. Most people thought he was a peaceful and quiet grandfather, cared for at times by his son and daughter-in-law. The police asked Marian a few questions, to which she answered as honestly as possible, believing there was nothing to hide, and concealment of the facts of what had happened, as she knew, was punishable by law. The girl was put into a police car, and as she walked along, accompanied by two men in uniform, people stared at her in silence. When she got into the car, people started whispering among themselves again. "What a nightmare. These young people have gone," shouted someone from the crowd. A little later, the doctors finished their work and carried out an elderly man on a stretcher. His face was not covered, and the villagers, seeing this, breathed a sigh of relief. The police had left, the ambulance had left, forensic experts had rushed to the scene. There was nothing to see here, as they were mostly inside the house. People went to their homes to sleep, and some people went about their daily business. The women, who were particularly impressionable, could not recover from what they had seen for a long time. They became afraid for their own lives. Nothing illegal had ever happened in this area, and no one, of course, did not expect that a murderer would come to the quiet place where mostly pensioners lived. A little later, grandparents began to go to each other and discuss what had happened. Some were even pleased that something worthwhile could finally be discussed. Barbara stopped by to see her friend Vanessa. "Vanessa, did you hear? Did you see what happened? Everyone's alive, old people are being slaughtered." "Why, what was Michael's problem?" "Yeah, I saw and heard. I was standing there this morning." "What do they say?" "She's a young girl." "She was young, but the weird thing is, she called the police and the ambulance." "Wait, what are you doing?" Barbara glared at her friend. "You're justifying her." "She's not here. I'm just saying it's weird. They're all bastards. They don't spare us old people. She came in, she wanted money, she wanted to make a profit, and Michael turned her down." "Yeah, I guess that's what happened." Prejudice was firmly planted in the woman's mind. She couldn't imagine anyone making excuses for someone who'd done grievous bodily harm to an elderly man. Not she. No one else in the area wanted to think that Michael Taylor was at fault, even though everyone knew that the girl had not run away but had stayed at his house until the police and ambulance arrived. And everyone knew about the oddities of the grandfather living at the entrance to the village. Marian was young and healthy, her victim, on the contrary, elderly and weak, And who would have thought that he wanted to rape his overnight guest, who out of desperation had risked spending the night with one of the residents of this ill-fated neighborhood? The investigation began. Michael was still in intensive care, but the doctors gave him a positive prognosis. Marian recounted all the details. She indicated the approximate time of events, talked about the nuances, answered all the questions put to her. In general, actively cooperated with the investigation, and the investigators saw that she was sincere, and her eyes were burning with the desire to get out of the detention center as soon as possible, to be acquitted. It was not only her unenviable position that marred Marian. Perhaps even more unpleasant was the fact that during her 5 days in the detention center she had never been contacted. There had been no messages or calls from either her mother or Stephen. Marian had wanted to call them both several times, but had hesitated. Something kept her from doing so. She wanted to be interested and waited for the call. So she felt that besides anxious thoughts about her future fate, she had other worries on her mind. And though they were not good either, yet in this way the girl was able to dilute her fear a little. Marian realized that she needed a good lawyer, and she still couldn't stand it. And while the investigation was dragging on and Michael had not yet come to his senses, it was worth worrying about her defense. After 5 days in the detention center, she called Stephen and told him everything. "Really, why didn't you call before?" he asked in confusion. "I was hoping you would call." Stephen had nothing to reply to these words. He really hadn't been concerned about her all these 5 days. Marian had only called the shop manager, and Marian thought that she might have told the others about her trouble. But to her surprise, her beloved Stephen knew nothing. "Do you need a lawyer?" he asked Marian. "Yes, I'm ashamed to ask for your help, but if you don't, no one will." "Tell me, didn't you defend yourself?" "Yes, I told everything to the investigation. Why such questions, Stephen?" Marian experienced emotional tension and was even annoyed when she heard the words of doubt from Stephen. He hurriedly reassured her. "Marian, it's okay, calm down. At least come and check on me. The lawyer will be you in which detention center you are sitting." Marian told him the number of the detention center. When she hung up, she realized that he didn't even want to visit her. He was evasive. Marian never called her mother. Somehow she wasn't particularly surprised by this. Disinterest in her daughter's life was a trait that had characterized Kimberly almost all her life. She had always regarded the girl as an obligation. And now, after a week without hearing from her, she concluded that she would come forward sooner or later. But if she is in distress, this important question was absent from the mother's mind in grief. "Morris, you have a visitor." Marian heard from the guard. A lawyer had come to see her, and her first question to him was, "Who are you from?" Stephen had not lied. He had sent his man to her, and he was ready to take up her case seriously and intimately. Mr. Christopher immediately reassured the defendant. "It's not a difficult case, just tell it like it is." Marian sighed, having to recall again the terrible story of the lustful owner of the house on the edge of the city. After about 20 minutes of careful listening, Mr. Christopher, a thin man, brunette, glasses, with a concentrated face, crossed his palms and moved a little closer to the accused. "You've done well. This is all very important. I think we're going to win this case." "I'd like to believe that." Shaking her head slightly, sadly, looking somewhere away, Marian said, "You know, by the way, that our Michael Taylor is already in the ward, awake, will soon testify." A strong color stuck to Marian's face. She was frightened. This must be bad. "Believe me, I have a lot of experience in these cases. He won't make it. Of course he'll tell his stories. It's a very good thing you're left with a clear beating. You have no motive. You stayed at the scene of the crime. Nothing was stolen. You can just calm down and wait for the exit." Mr. Christopher collected his papers in his briefcase, and after saying goodbye and wishing Marian patience, he left. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Well, you tell me, come on." A large, tall man in shirt and trousers almost ran into the room. He looked about 40 years old and was in an agitated state. "How did they let you in? Quarantine?" The grandfather looked at his son in surprise. "Dad, they let me in, and let me in." The man sat down on a chair near his father's bed. He looked at him patiently, waiting for some explanation of what had happened. "Why, you don't know anything yourself, lawyer." "Dad, I know everything. I want to hear you. Is she some kind of psychopath?" "She didn't even take anything. She wanted to kill me." Michael got up from the bed in a state of near rage. Well, calm down, Dad, calmed his son, gently put his hands on his shoulders. Lie down, rest if you want. Let's not talk about it now. No, you started it, I'll continue. Sadist, she wanted to kill me. How do I know why? Michael Taylor was clearly in a bad mood. His son Edward was determined to derail the conversation. In between asking him questions about his health, about the hospital kitchen and the doctors, he decided that he would have to come again when his father had calmed down and was ready to talk about what had happened in his home without emotion. For Marian, the time spent in the isolation ward dragged on at a terribly slow pace. Mr. Christopher had failed to fully convince her that her actions would qualify as self-defense. Some uncomfortable feeling could not leave her, as if everything was not so simple in this case. On the eve of the hearing, Mr. Christopher once again went to see his client. He was in high spirits and simply confident of victory. Marian, don't worry, everything will be fine. Tomorrow be sure and say everything as you told me. You were in agitation, plus self-defense, attempted rape. That'll put our Michael Taylor in jail, Marian's lawyer said with a smile on his face. The convict was silent for most of this conversation, just nodding and occasionally speaking. I see. The closer the trial got, the more anxious she felt. The night before the trial, Marian remembered her mother, brother, and sister. She had a strange feeling that the family had a life of its own, and that they were not her own people. Little by little, she began to involuntarily forget their images and memories associated with the house. The trial began in the morning. Marian prepared herself for the trial. She had her hair combed and even put on a little makeup and wore a clean change of clothes that she had taken with her to the detention center. She looked like a normal, decent, and civilized girl. The image at the trial had to play a positive role. In her case, it was important. Many had already labeled Marian a dangerous criminal, a marginal, and a thief. There were rumors that Michael was not the first victim of the killer, and that she dealt exclusively with lonely pensioners. But this time she had a serious client. Everyone in the area knew of Marian's blunder. Marian sat behind the bar and watched the people entering the hall. She said hello to Mr. Christopher, and he once again cheered her up by saying, "It's going to be fine. Marian Morris." Some of Michael's neighbors came in. Marian hadn't seen them, of course, and wouldn't remember them, but they were elderly people, outwardly different from the city folk, and she concluded that it was Michael's support group that had come. She saw him too, but immediately looked away. He still disgusted her. Sitting next to him was apparently his lawyer, a tall, statuesque man in his mid-40s. The most unexpected thing for the defendant happened when a woman and her teenage son, who were very familiar to her, entered the courtroom. It was Kimberly and Jack, Marian's mother and brother. She stared at them for a long moment, wonderingly trying to meet her mother's gaze. Jack waved his hand to his sister, but her mother immediately cut him off. She did not look at her daughter, feeling that she was looking at her. Why did she come here? And with Jack thought Marian. The hearing of the case began. When Michael's lawyer introduced himself to Marian, she turned pale. His last name was Taylor, the same as her abuser's. She stared at his face, then shifted her gaze to the victim. Yes, they did look alike. Was it really his relative? His son Marian no longer expected anything good from this trial. Though her defender, Mr. Christopher, looked quite confident in his statement, but when his opponent began his speech, he began to listen carefully to his words. The speech was filled with complex language, and everyone with a little knowledge of the law realized that this man was serious and knew his case well. Many were also struck by the emotionality with which he spoke about the case. Especially attentive guessed what was the reason for such an ardent concern of the lawyer to the old victim, who risked to become the accused that day. Alas, it did not happen. Against all sound logic, against Mr. Christopher's efforts, and against all the facts that had been presented to the court, Marian was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for robbery. Hearing the judge's words, Mr. Christopher's face changed. What assault? He addressed the judge so that no one could hear him. What's the matter with you? Mr. Christopher, sit down and calm down. You'll appeal if you have to. The judge answered him calmly. The man looked shattered. He had lost, a rare event in his 20 years of practice. Marian saw the bailiffs as they approached. She watched Mr. Christopher's face, hoping he would look at her, though she didn't know why she wanted to make contact with him. He stood gloomily for a moment in one place. and pretending to be so puzzled that he had forgotten Marian, walked slowly towards the exit. "Mr. Christopher, what now?" Marian shouted. The bailiffs had already entered the defendant's cell, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Christopher disappeared into the crowd of spectators leaving the hall. Marian was still in the detention center for some time. She kept waiting for Stephen's call, still unwilling to accept the fact that she would soon be a prisoner. Maybe they'll reconsider, appeal, she thought, sitting within the four walls of this horrible room she was never supposed to enter. Finally, Marian got a phone call. It was her young man, though she wasn't sure anymore. His voice was initially depressed, and that didn't bode well for Marian. "Well, what is it?" In a pleading voice she asked. "Yes, Marian, you see, Mr. Christopher is a very good lawyer. I paid him a lot. He didn't expect this, you know. The thing is, this Edward, he's the freak's son. But not only that. What else? He's a powerful lawyer. I heard that Michael, this weirdo in there with them, did not want to live with them in the city. Wanted to his native village, where he grew up. All these long summarizations were not only unnecessary for Marian, but also irritating. Unable to bear it any longer, she asked Stephen. "Why are you telling me all this? Is it bad or not?" "Marian, I don't have that much money. Mr. Christopher told me the amount, but it's a lot too. Others will take even more. And this one is an acquaintance." "How much, Stephen?" Marian asked, almost crying. "Well, 1 million. We, of course, on friendly terms, agreed that half of the amount in case of loss he will return. But you know, 100,000,000 I cannot get nowhere. But it's just 1 million. Stephen, I'm going down, you know." There was an uncomfortable silence at both ends of the wire. Stephen kept silent because he didn't want to offend or upset the girl. Marian said nothing. She waited for his final answer. "Marian," finally softly spoke Stephen. "Well, first of all, it is a colony of settlement. It is not strict regime, and secondly, well, 5 years and parole. I'm sure you will go out on parole." These words were too horrible for Marian. She hung up the phone. Marian, hello?" On this day, Territorial Superintendent Stephen Howard decided to take no further interest in this girl's life. When she tried to call him for help and made her most fatal and possibly stupid decision of her life to go to a sleepover with a stranger, he was having a great time with a nice lady who had been waiting for reciprocation from him for a long time. Lately, Stephen had been unsure of his feelings for the young and simple girl Marian, because one way or another he was influenced by the opinion of those around him. He was independent and had no authority. But one day he himself thought that he felt uncomfortable in the company of a shop girl, or maybe he just took and changed because people change. Marian Morris, a 24-year-old shop assistant at a grocery shop chain. The girl, circumstances that one day did not work out in her favor, went to the colony. At first she was scared, but fortunately in the colony of settlement lived, and quite decent, not broken by prison women. It was to such women that the newcomer tried to get closer. Still, sometimes she had to show her teeth here. Like in the men's prison, this colony had its own chief or pahanka. Her name was Jennifer, and this was the 4th time she had been here. One had to respect this imposing woman with a not very feminine tattoo on her arm. There were always a few female settlers walking beside her like jackals. All of these women were unpleasant in appearance. From their appearance you could roughly determine their articles. One was a thief with experience. Another killed her husband in another drunkenness. But Jennifer herself, already in the 4th time, caught in a major fraud. She began her dirty career with an assistant to a serious businessman and part-time criminal mastermind of the city, and it was back in the 90s. Young Jennifer liked to live life to the fullest, and even after the first walk, she decided not to stop there and become even more successful. Except that the woman never wanted to earn according to conscience. She had no children, no husbands, and somewhere in her hometown remained an unhappy mother. Not long ago, who learned from neighbors about the criminal biography of her daughter, Jennifer all told her that she went abroad for a long time, and she piously believed her and even rejoiced for her in anticipation of seeing her only beloved daughter again. But through one of her neighbors, the truth was accidentally revealed. It was before Jennifer's last conviction. She and her mother had had a terrible fight, and in her heart, her daughter called her some very nasty words and left. A few weeks later, she had another case she wanted to drop because it was quite a risky move, but remembering the difficult conversation with her mother, she decided, "Okay, nobody needs me here anyway." and again Jennifer and several of her partners had to go to jail for fraud. Marian was settling in. It wasn't so bad. She found something new to do here. She started sewing often, even when her working hours were over. She was also fond of beading, and this activity calmed her and temporarily removed all bad thoughts from her head. Somewhere in the sewing room on a shelf there was a magazine with weaving schemes. That afternoon Marian studied it and asked one of the inmates, the shop manager, to get some beads so that she could make crafts from the magazine. Margaret, the supervisor's name, was a kind and understanding person, and to Marian's delight, in a couple of days she brought her a large amount of material for her new creation. Her meditations, sitting on her bunk and threading the little balls on the thread one by one, Marian began to forget all her troubles, enjoying her work, which almost from the beginning she had been doing well. Interrupting her positive thoughts, 4 women entered the cell. Jennifer was among them. Marian was afraid of this bulky woman, partly because she almost never walked alone, and many colonists had told of her cruelty. Jennifer looked at Marian with a contemptuous smile, who pretended not to notice the women who had entered the room. But how could she not notice them? "What are you doing in business, new girl?" Marian's plowwoman asked impudently. Realizing from Jennifer's tone that she did not come in peace, Marian decided not to answer anything. "I made up a nickname for her, Beads," shouted one of Jennifer's 6. All but the main one appreciated her friend's joke and laughed too. It was an unpleasant sight. These ladies were clearly out of the local color of the colony, which in general was not so bad. "All right, I'm not supposed to be quiet around here. Last name, first name." Jennifer spoke. "Marian Morris." Marian put her work aside and looked at the woman. The newcomer's eyes were full of a confidence uncommon to newcomers, and a kind of desperate insolence, which was of course bad form for someone like her. "Are you so bold?" Jennifer asked in surprise. Marian again made no reply, thinking the colonist's behavior a provocation. Her behavior offended the unspoken leader of the colony. "Well, I hear you've been weaving your stuff around here, that you've started selling it, but that's not the way it works. So 80% of your shit is coming to me. Look, it'll be under control." Marian remained stubbornly silent. She picked up her weave and continued working as if they had all left the cell. "Have you learnt everything?" No, Marian answered. "But then, now the girls will crush you a little." And for a few moments Jennifer waited. She hoped that Marian, under the pressure of the threat, would agree to her unprofitable business plan. But alas, she gave her friends a gesture, and they began to approach Marian. A fight broke out. Jennifer, as former prisoners, calculated everything. Almost no one was in the building of the colony. All went to community service. The administration was usually eating lunch at this time, and there were no guards here to monitor the prisoners. Marian didn't scream for help. She wasn't the tiniest girl, but she had never been in a fight before. She reckoned that this was her first time as well, for against Michael she was rather just defending herself. Of course she couldn't do it against 3 men, but she remembered the feeling of overwhelming rage she had felt when the man responsible for her mangled fate had touched her underwear. Jennifer's girls had had it. For one ended with a broken nose, for another with a black eye and a nail-scarred cheek. Still, Marian was beaten. She lay on the floor, holding her stomach. It only hurt, but surprisingly she did not feel fear, resentment, or despair that day or later. Marian lay on the floor for some time, beaten by the felons, though she was able to get up. Then she crawled quietly from the floor to her bunk and put her hands on her head. She thought about her future fate in this place. Jennifer, strangely enough, had stopped pestering the needlewoman who had appeared in the colony and had told her own not to hurt her either. "Morris, don't touch her. She's a hard woman of ours. I heard that she wanted to kill the old man who was bothering her," she told the girls. The colony's chief gangster even developed a certain sympathy for this young prisoner with a beautiful and rare name. Marian worked exclusively for herself, giving her trinkets to the girls and women with whom she most often socialized, or even selling them. One day, one of the prison authorities took an interest in her work, and that's how Marian got her first big money in prison. The work was painstaking, but the necklace of pink flowers came out simply amazing, and all in joy the customer paid her $2,000 for her hard work. Soon Marian decided to follow the example of some other women from the colony who had been in captivity for a long time and were beginning to go mad from the monotony of their lives. Some of them also began to weave beads, and some of them sewed clothes from patterns, And there were also those who simply embroidered cross-stitch, so to speak, for the soul. And you have brought creativity into our society. Look, everyone is doing something. Lillian sits all day long and embroiders her flowers. Yes, I can see it's fun, Marian smiled. Linda was the nicest person she had ever met. She was not only interesting to talk to, but also to share her feelings. This prisoner had a feeling of caring for Marian and her fate. She was the first to hear the story of the lustful old man from whom she had to defend herself. At first, Marian's story shocked her, and she could not calm down for a long time, asking her friend about the case, whether it was possible to appeal against the court decision, and whether there were people ready to fight for her. Then, having learnt that the girl had a bigger problem in her free life than her criminal record, namely the complete indifference of all her relatives and acquaintances, including her mother, Linda calmed down and stopped asking her uncomfortable questions and just sympathized with her. A year passed. No one had visited Marian once during that time. At first, listening to stories of women about how their visits with their mother, with their son, with their husband had gone. She became sad and even at times wanted to cry. Then she got used to this pain and dissolved in her daily activities. So in beading, community service, socializing with good girls from the colony, and thinking about life after prison, 2 more years passed unnoticed. Marian turned 27 years old. She was young, beautiful, and forced to sit in jail only because she had prevented a lusty old man from being abused. A few days after her birthday, which she celebrated in a tight circle of good friends, Linda among them, she was summoned to the office of the colony director. Marian was terrified and told Linda about the event. "Yes, wait. Why are you nervous?" Linda hurried to calm her friend. "I don't know. What if I did something wrong? Maybe it's because of the sale of their products." "Well, you told me that Cheryl Jones ordered something from you." "Yeah, that's why it's weird. I've been trying to remember for 3 years, and I can't figure out where I went wrong." "Look, what makes you think it's something bad? What's good?" Marian grinned nervously. The girl, even though she liked the life in captivity lately, she was counting the days until she left the colony. She had only 2 years left, and again she could live as a human being in freedom. However, thinking about it a little deeper, she began to get a little upset. "I'll get out, but what then? Where to go? I won't go to my mom. I won't go to Stephen, but he won't expect me." Marian knew that she would have to look for a job and a place to live. And these thoughts burdened her, and yet Marian looked forward to freedom. Like most of the women in the colony who'd come here, some for robbery, some for theft, and some like her by coincidence by life's injustices. She walked slowly to her boss's office, fearing not only bad news from him, but illegal actions. Now, after the incident with Michael, she was afraid of strange men, and willy-nilly in ambiguous situations the girl was frightened. She became uncomfortable and frightened. "Marian Morris, why are you standing there?" "I'm waiting for you." The headmaster, a man in his 50s with a full head of gray, looked out of the office. "Hello," Marian replied briefly. William Butler, that was the name of the director of the colony, politely asked the prisoner to sit down. As she entered the office, she immediately noticed the woman sitting at the large desk to the left of the director's desk. Now she was no longer so afraid of William Butler. The woman was Amanda Hill, a social worker who had worked with the female prisoners here for a long time, and she had a kind face. The colonists loved Amanda. Yes, she could not solve all the burning questions of her wards, but she always sincerely tried to help people in their trouble. And just a personal conversation with her was sometimes a balm to the soul of these women. Amanda had no children, and she seemed to give all her motherly love to them. "Marian Morris, how are you enjoying your stay in our institution, so to speak?" William Butler chuckled slightly at his own words, shifting his gaze from Marian to the teacher. "It's fine, I like it." Marian was startled, and it was noticeable. "Marian Morris, can I ask why you're so tense right now?" Amanda addressed the prisoner. "I'm worried," Marian replied. "Why should you be worried?" Smiled William Butler, who, according to Marian's findings, had been a lively and cheerful man that day. There was silence. William Butler was staring at some papers. Perhaps it was a file on the prisoner Morris. Amanda Hill was careful not to let Marian notice her gaze. "All right, ladies, well, Marian Morris, your lawyer, Mr. Christopher, has filed a motion with the court for your parole." "How?" Marian was surprised. "Didn't you know anything?" No. Marian was confused. Stephen hadn't reported in for 3 years. Was it Mr. Christopher's own initiative? She could not believe that she might be able to get out of the colony early. The prisoner's face changed visibly. She was radiant with joy. But she tried not to show it and listened attentively to William Butler. So you talk to Amanda and she'll tell you everything. There'll be a medical examination soon, mind you, and then the trial. In general, I've written you the most positive characteristic, because we here with comrades know about your hobbies, that you sew there, or beadwork, you're about to do it, and that you have a positive influence on the inmates of the colony. In general, the main thing is not to worry and believe in the best. So the court will decide. Marian asked anxiously. Yes, the court will decide everything, but we are for you. Marian thanked William Butler for the good news, and together with Amanda they went out to talk. As they wandered around the large colony grounds, they chatted about the parole process. Marian asked the educator with great interest about how it would go and what she herself had to do to be granted parole. At night before she went to bed, she was full of bright new impressions and thought of Mr. Christopher. Why did he help her? Marian was quite sure that the man had already forgotten her in that unpleasant case. It had been a long time since she had thought of him, but as it turned out, he not only remembered, but was willing to help her. The medical board found no reason to deny Morris parole. A little later, a hearing was held in the local court, where the only familiar face in the room this time was Mr. Christopher. The hearing was quick and successful. The result was the granting of the application for conditional early release of the convict under the article robbery, which meant that in 10 days, young, beautiful, and still not broken, believing in the best, Marian Morris was waiting for her long-awaited freedom. She already knew about it from the words of ex-criminals who had once been released on parole. It was the beginning of March. Although the whole earth was still covered with snow, and in general in nature there were almost no signs of spring, Marian felt it with all her body and with all her soul. She wanted to shout, freedom. But the girl's quiet disposition prevented her from doing so. She stood for some time near the high fence with barbed wire, smoking and greedily gulping the air, which this day seemed much sweeter than before. Well, Marian went to her hometown, and this time she had money with her, and there she rented a place to live. In this she was helped by one of her acquaintances, with whom they had established good contacts while Marian was still in the colony. They began to communicate even more often than before. No one helped Marian with work. She soon found a job as a saleswoman at a cash register. The problems of the former prisoner began almost immediately after the beginning of life on the outside. It was not bad, and Marian liked it very much. A fresh start, perhaps, so she imagined her future fate when she was behind bars. But a couple of weeks later, a manager approached her at work when she was putting the goods on the shelves. "Marian, can I have a word with you?" "Yes, say it right here." "What are you talking about?" Marian asked, engrossed in her work. "Marian, it won't work here. It's important." They both went outside. The weather was fine. It was April, and it was even hot at times. "Marian, you see, today I was told from above. They say that you do not meet the qualification requirements here." The manager was very embarrassed. It was hard for her to inform this hard-working girl, who from the very first days of her work in this small grocery shop began to show enthusiasm and professionalism, that she was fired. "I see I don't fit in." Marian grinned. "Marian, what can I do?" "I was told to tell you." "Yeah, it's all about the criminal record. I know it's not your fault." Even though Marian was depressed that day, she knew there was no point in trying so hard to please the manager. She finished the day perfectly, without any complaints. "I'm sorry to see you go," her boss told her as she walked her out the next day. Marian just smiled sadly and walked to the bus stop with a cigarette. She smoked more and more often and worried about her future fate. It was an unpleasant day for Marian. She realized that she had no money to pay her rent and no success in finding a new job. She didn't want to be a beggar to her mother, but she decided to visit her family, at least to see her brother Jack and sister Cassandra. She stood for a long time in front of the windows of her home, hesitating to enter. It was her pride. In 3 years, her mother had never once bothered to find out about her. How could it be? Suddenly her mind was full of different thoughts. What if something had happened to her? What if Marian, horrified at her own reasoning, went with a quick step into the flat? It was late in the evening. Everyone must be at home, and she rang the doorbell. It was Marian. She answered briefly to the sound of the inner door opening. A male, unfamiliar voice was heard in the distance. Another minute of fussing outside the door, and she was opened. "Marian, what are you doing here so early?" It was not a joke, it was a real misunderstanding on her mother's part, and Marian did not know whether to laugh or cry. In simple words, she was not welcome here. She walked to the living room. Her sister Cassandra was sitting there watching cartoons. Is it really her, Marian thought. The girl was all grown up, had grown-up features. Marian. Cassandra broke away from the TV series and ran up to her older sister. Marian couldn't contain her emotions. She took the girl in her arms, even though she was already overweight, and spun her around a little in front of her. "Cassandra, have you grown so big? You're 13, aren't you?" "Wow. I'm 13. And you're 20? Marian stared at her sister. Then her face turned from surprise to full of joyful emotion, and she laughed. "Cassandra, are you doing well in maths?" "How much?" Marian wondered. "I won't tell you." An unfamiliar man entered the room. He reluctantly said hello to his guest. Matthew. Matthew was tall and broad-shouldered and looked to be about 50 years old. Marian. "Nice to meet you. I'm your mother's husband." "I see," Marian replied quietly. Also, a lot had changed here, but not her mother's attitude towards her. "Mum, where's Jack?" Marian asked her mother at the table. They had all sat down to supper. "Jack lives alone now, not far from here. Would you like the address?" "Yes, of course." "Are you going to sleep over?" "No," said Marian modestly. "Come on. Where would you go at night? Do you have a place to stay or not?" Kimberly tried to be a bit of a caring mother, but she was not very good at it, and it didn't last long. The housemates persuaded Marian to stay the night and prepared a cot with clean linen. Before going to bed, Kimberly visited her daughter and they chatted about the detention. Marian talked about the future and the good lawyer, Mr. Christopher. And then her mother, for the umpteenth time in this life, upset her. "Marian," said gently and quietly to Kimberly, "I beg you very much, don't pretend to live here. Matthew and I are living so well. Jack has moved out. I'm finally happy. You understand me as a woman." "Mum," said Marian, "I'm not claiming anything." And that was the end of the conversation. They said goodnight to each other, and then Marian packed her things and left. Before leaving, her mother wanted to slip some note into her pocket. It was only 500, but Marian grinned sweetly, handed the money back and said, "Leave it. It's more important to you." She looked at Cassandra, who was as always staring at the television, even though the day was just beginning and she didn't even notice that Marian was leaving. The touching feeling she had for her was still there. She was a little sister, but Marian realized that everyone here would always be a stranger to her, and 13-year-old Cassandra was becoming more and more like her mother, losing her naive and childlike image. "Cassandra, at least go say goodbye to Marian." The girl reluctantly started and walked towards the corridor, all looking back at the TV screen. "Well, Cassandra, goodbye." Marian walked wherever she was going. She was only paying a month in advance, which meant that in a week or so she would have to move out due to not being able to pay for the room. She just wanted to wander around her hometown. Tears came to her at one point as she thought of her mother's words to her the night before. Marian hadn't been lying when she said she didn't need a place to live. She herself did not want to live in a flat with a strange man, and a man who would never be her family, who was only nominally so. Mother, who is this? Is it only worth giving birth to be called by that great sacred word? The last bright idea of family was disappearing in the girl's soul. She was at liberty, but she had neither work nor lodging, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. Stephen, the last time they had seen each other was a long time ago. It was early February, a whole 3 years ago. Back then, their relationship had come to a head and ended without announcement because Marian had gone to juvie. He was relatively young, good-looking, and successful. "I don't stand a chance," thought Marian as she sat in her room, listening to the occasional scandalous yelling coming from the next room. It was late in the evening. Without deciding anything, she went to bed. In the morning, having filtered all her thoughts and considerations overnight, Marian decided to go to Stephen's. She wasn't counting on anything, just financial help. He had helped her with her lawyer after all, and you could say, albeit indirectly, he had been involved in her parole. Perhaps he would give her some money for the first time, and that was fine with the ex-convict. who was practically at the bottom of her life. She wrote him a short message. "It's Varia. I'm free. You don't be afraid of me. I'm still the same. Tomorrow I'll be outside the shop at the Forest Cafe at 8. Marian was waiting for him at the table, drinking coffee. He was on time. He didn't have to wait a minute. From even farther away he smiled and pronounced, "Well, here we meet at last." Marian didn't hear anything, but smiled too and waved at him. "Yes, I see you, hello." The man hugged his acquaintance warmly and sat down opposite. "How are you?" asked Marian. "Yes, better than anyone else. I went even higher." "Wow, and what are you now?" "Yeah, I'm a regional manager. We don't just have New York locations anymore. We have Chicago, Florida, and Washington, D.C. now. So they're all over the place. Luckily, I was here yesterday and I'm here today. I'll be somewhere else tomorrow." "Wow." Marian was surprised. "You're doing great." "Just a little." Stephen smiled satisfactorily, full of pride. "I congratulate you on this event." "Thanks, but what about you?" "Got a place to live? Got a job?" "Well, it's hard right now. I couldn't even get a job at a grocery store." "I don't know, I'll keep looking." "And housing?" "I've been living in a flat for the last week." She sighed heavily and sadly. "What's wrong, Marian?" Stephen asked gently. "I don't want to be a beggar, but I'm in a bad situation." "Come on, Marian, we always help our own. I'll put 1,100 on your card for the first time. If you have any problems, just ask." Marian was glad that at least someone on this earth was not indifferent to her difficult situation. She had become accustomed to hardship, not wanting to live at the expense of others, and the money Stephen had given her she saw simply as salvation. No longer did she want to use it. Sitting in a cafe, she saw the ring on his finger and realized he was married. Stephen probably had children by now as well. He was a little different from his old self. He didn't have that lightness, and he spoke to her in a polite, decent way, leaving no hint at the end of the evening of any further development of the relationship. He was also a stranger to her, and yet she was grateful to him for another rescue. Standing on the balcony of her new accommodation, which she had paid for 2 months in advance, now feeling relatively stable, Marian smoked and enjoyed the cool late April day. She was determined. "I'll look for a job and I'll find one, but people. Who do I need? Self has me." She raised her head high, closed her eyes, and through the small slit of her thin lips, slowly the thick cigarette smoke seeped out. The summer came. Marian found a job. She was hired at a beauty parlor, cleaning the premises. She didn't just scrub the floors. The girl watched the work of masters who painted the visitors' nails, cut hair, corrected eyebrows, and applied eyelashes. In the future, Marian wanted to learn one of these professions, but to do this, it was necessary to earn money for the courses. When she had the first money, she immediately went to a needlework shop and bought a lot of beads. In the evenings, tired from scrubbing the parlor floors, Marian strung the little balls on thread, remembering her days in the colony. Strange thoughts crossed her mind. She missed those days, for in that life there were people like herself with whom she could have a heart-to-heart talk, and they wouldn't look at you as an outsider, no matter what you told them about your plight. One fine day, and it was fine, because it was a Saturday, Marian received a call from a stranger. Here we go, another divorce. Who else could it be, she thought sadly. Still, Marian answered the call. "Hello, I'm listening." There was silence. Marian was about to press the red button, but then she heard a man's voice. "Is this Marian?" "Yes, Marian, who is this?" "Marian, don't hang up right away." It's the man on the other end of the line was breathing heavily. He seemed to be having a hard time speaking. "Tell me, who are you?" Marian asked in bewilderment. "I'm your dad. I have a lot to say, but don't hang up." "I'm not hanging up." "Calm down. Which dad is it, Marcus?" "No, this is your real daddy. My name is Sebastian. I was in contact with your mom, Kimberly, about 30 years ago. I'm asking you not to reject me right away. You're not living well. You need alimony. You'd better be honest with me." Marian replied resentfully, thinking that this man wanted only profit from her. "We are like that," replied the man cheerfully. "Well, I'm for honesty. No one needs me in this life, Papa, and I have no money, and I have no home. I have nothing and nobody." "Yes, I know, but I have everything, but I have no one to share it with. You're the only one I've got." Well, will you come visit me in Florida? Where? Marian asked me. I live in Florida, I have my own business here. I know your mom a little bit. So I told her like you, that I have nothing. I'm starving, I need help. She told me about you too. She said let her provide for you, but I knew you were my daughter. Anyway, it's not a phone conversation. I'll send you my address, come and talk to me. Marian hung up the phone. She realized that everything in her life very soon and very abruptly changed. Not resenting fate, not expecting anything good from it, and yet not being angry at the world. Through suffering, pain, betrayals, and hardships, she finally waited for her bright streak.
John was happy today. He had finally made up with his fiancée, Christina. In fact, John didn't fight with her at all. Christine had a tendency to get offended and throw tantrums on the spot, as is typical of rich, spoiled girls. But he loved his beauty and did not notice unpleasant flaws in her character, like all lovers. That's why, when John saw a flower stall shining with colorful lights, he stopped his serve to buy the most luxurious bouquet he could find there. After all, Christina had fine taste and high demands, so a bouquet from the supposedly guilty John had to match her status. However, the mood was still spoiled when he came out of the store with a huge bouquet and did not find his car. Such surprises were not to his liking. "Where's my car?" "What kind of mayhem is this?" he shouted to a road worker who was painting the curbs nearby. "Didn't you see the sign or what? Parking is forbidden here." "Your car was taken to the parking lot," the worker replied. "I have a fiancé waiting for me at the restaurant. I can't be late. And I left my phone in the car. I went out for 5 minutes." "How can you do that?" "Yeah, they all go out and get divorced like that. Shit, the parking lot's around the corner. Pay the fine and go to your fiancé. It's a piece of cake." "Here comes a major with flowers. He won't let people do their jobs," said the road builder. John did not answer him. Every minute was precious to him. But why did he have such bad luck today? He took the bouquet under his arm and ran. And when he saw the sign penalty parking lot, he rushed to the booth where the officer on duty was sitting. "I have my car brought to you here now, a black SUV. Here's the paperwork. I need to pick it up right away. I'm late for an important meeting." "No problem," replied the parking lot employee on duty. "Pay the fine, take your swallow, but I only accept cash." Writing out the receipt and looking for change from the large bill John had given him to pay seemed like an eternity. "You can have change already. Keep the money." "I'm really in a hurry," John said, pleased with the turnaround. The guard obligingly showed him where John's impounded car was parked. The lot itself, where the cars were located, was untidy and shabby. It was evident that the guard had a shoddy attitude. The cars were arranged as they were. One gate was open. His automobile stood a little farther back. The guard took the pads off the wheel and was about to leave, but John stopped him. "Why is the car door open?" he asked the guard. "I don't know. Maybe you forgot to lock it." "What? I sure didn't leave them." "You can look on the cameras, and the keys were definitely there." John slapped his forehead. "You've got to be so careless. There's someone in there." "Look," the guard exclaimed fearfully and pointed his finger at the interior of the car. Suddenly, from inside, someone's palm lay on the glass. It was covered with blood. The hand disappeared, leaving a bloody trace on the car window. And then there was a heartbreaking, inhuman scream. It was a woman. John rushed to the car and opened the back door. What he saw shocked him. He froze for a few seconds and stared in horror at what was happening. "Mother dear, you have an incident here," shouted the watchman, peering out from behind John's shoulder. "Help, I'm going to die," shouted the young girl as loud as she could, and passed out from the pain. "Run, call an ambulance, and then get some hot water in here," John Watchman shouted in a commanding voice. He began frantically rummaging through the first aid kit. Finding alcohol, he put it to the laboring woman's face. She woke up. John put a pillow under her head and clean disposable sheeting under her lower body. Luckily, he had a whole pile of them. He often had to carry his dog in the car. There were also clean sheets and towels, which John had luckily picked up from the dry cleaners today. Don't be afraid, breathe. What did the midwives or whoever it is that deals with pregnant women teach you? My name is John. He tried to somehow distract the young woman from her fear. Sarah, my name is Sarah. She began to have contractions. She screamed and squeezed John's hand with such force that he thought something crunched. And then he himself cried out in pain, either from fright at the stranger screaming like a wounded animal, or it was already time. But a second later the baby's head showed. Now push, John shouted, oblivious to his own pain. Come on, it's going to be okay. And help is on the way, and so the baby was born, a red, defenseless lump with clenched fists. John picked him up, slapped him on the butt to make him cry and take his first breath. Then he wrapped the baby in a clean sheet. John thanked God to himself that he had bought a stove that was so warm and spacious. Boy, you've got a boy, John announced joyfully. Sarah smiled, but immediately a grimace of searing, unbearable pain contorted her face again. Mommy, mommy, she screamed. And again the exertions began in a wave. Another child was born, also a boy, but only a little smaller. He cried on his own and began waving his tiny hands. John quickly swaddled him too. The babies fell silent, warmed in the warmth of the car. Sarah lay exhaustedly under the blanket John had offered. Thank you. Without your help I'd be lost. My darling sons. I'm so glad everything's all right. Oh, I'm so thirsty I can't stand it. And John quickly gave her some mineral water. She greedily drank half a bottle and smiled again. I'm sorry I got your car dirty. The contraction started on the way, and I was carrying my suitcase. I saw the car standing there, and I pulled the door open. I thought, whatever happens, happens. I sat on the back seat, and then I don't remember anything. I guess I blacked out from the pain, and there you are, my hero named John O. I soiled all the seats for you. I'm sorry. Come on, what's the chair? The main thing is that the boys are fine. They're all alive, and you did a good job. I almost fainted. Honestly, John laughed. How's it going in here? A guard ran up to them with a belated basin of water. There's an ambulance coming. Wow, you had 2 babies at once. What a mother. A minute later, doctors and a paramedic arrived and carried Sarah into the ambulance. Twins, John shouted. And for some reason, without knowing why, he felt proud of himself. It was as if they were his children. And it was true. There were no other people's children. I thought I'd give Christine a hint that it's time to become parents. Where are you taking them? John asked the ambulance driver. To Central City, he replied briefly, and turned on the siren. And John stood and looked at the little people he did not know. The little people he had had a hand in saving. His soul overflowed with joy for Sarah and her sons. Of course, John felt proud of himself. He had not expected himself to be so fearless, and was determined to have at least 3 children. With this news and the desire to share the unusual event, John went on a date with Christine. Arriving at the restaurant exactly 2 hours late, he realized that the bride had already left. And you have a note from Mrs. Barnova, the waiter said, handing John a doubled folded piece of paper. The smile slid off his face as soon as he read the contents of the message. It read as follows: How could you? I waited for you for an hour. During that time, I realized that you don't care for me at all. Why do I need such a fiancé? What a businessman. My father has more money. And you're not that handsome? You know, I'll find someone better. You bet I will. Good luck. Loser. After these words, John became completely upset. His strength had left him. And no wonder. The day had been absolutely crazy. Not everyone could handle so many problems at once. For some reason, he didn't want to call Christine and make excuses. To withstand the onslaught of his fiancée, you need energy. which he didn't have right now, like a dead battery. But John knew what could restore his strength. A faithful friend waiting for him at home in a hot bath. Half an hour later, John was in the garden of his two-story house, which he had also taken part in building, anticipating the aroma of birch broom and bath steam. The first thing John did was to flood the small wooden bathhouse in the backyard. Only now he felt how hungry he was when he entered the house. A fluffy whirlwind came at him with a joyous bark. It was Caesar, John's dog, who had recently turned a year old. He was a most faithful companion to his master. "Did you miss me?" John hugged the dog and ruffled his thick coat. Caesar barked merrily and wagged his tail. Then he stood on his hind legs and licked the face of his beloved master. And a couple minutes later, the dog was scrabbling at the door with his paw, hinting that he needed to leave to go about his doggy business. "Okay, you go for a walk, and I'll make you and me something to eat," John said tiredly. There hadn't been a crumb in his mouth since morning. While Caesar ran around the yard and chased the neighbor's cats off the property, John made a simple bachelor's dinner: scrambled eggs and baccia, and a vegetable salad. A good piece of meat with a bone was defrosted for Caesar. Smelling the food through the open kitchen window, Caesar began to beg for home, notifying the neighborhood with his barking that it was time for a snack for such a smart boy and master. "Come on, Stray." John smiled and put a bowl full of food in front of his friend. He licked his master's hand in gratitude. "Why, Caesar? Feel better about yourself?" "My fiancée left me today and didn't even give me an explanation," John complained to him. "You're the only one who truly loves me and will never betray me. It doesn't matter to you whether I'm rich or poor, handsome or not so handsome. You just love me and that's it." I laid John's head in my lap, as if taking his pain away. Caesar came into the house quite by accident. John had found him at a construction site he was managing. He was just a little puppy, a tiny, half-naked lump who couldn't crawl. He just whimpered, starving and cold. John picked him up, put him in his breast pocket, and took him to the vet. Then the doctor shook his head and said that the newborn was unlikely to survive. But just in case, he prescribed vitamins and antibiotic shots. John didn't give up. He took the puppy out, gently looked after it, and gave the injections himself. In 2 weeks, the puppy was walking, waddling unsteadily on stubby legs. But he ate for 5 people, which made his belly swell to such an extent that the poor dog would laughingly fall over on his side. Experts, having examined the dog, decided that it was a mix of a Caucasian sheepdog with a yard dog. Apparently, the breeder threw out a poor-quality puppy, having separated it from its mother, because no dog in the world will abandon its cub of its own free will. In addition, the dog discovered one interesting peculiarity. At the same time playing with the ball, he could listen to music and sing along. Subtle. For this he was named Caesar. A couple hours later, the companions were each asleep in their own beds. John on the couch, still undressed from fatigue, and his 4-legged friend suddenly collapsed next to him on the rug, and no force, even in the form of the beautiful Christine, who hated Caesar, could separate the two friends. In the morning, the phone rang. John jumped up like a scalded man. It was 0900 hours. He had overslept for the first time in his life. "Boss, where are you? Why aren't you picking up the phone?" Worried, the assistant asked. "I had to hold a meeting without you and tell the directors you were sick. What happened? Need any help?" "Oh, sure it happened. Like lots of things," John said in a tired voice. "Yesterday, for example, people were born right in my car. Can you believe that? And then I got dumped by a hot girl on top of that. Just like that." "Yeah, business," Mike replied after a short silence. "Are you okay? By the way, do you know what you can carry to the maternity ward?" "Well, what should be carried in the gears? Maybe some things. You have a daughter, don't you?" "Well, ask my wife and send you the list." "Well, you're really something, brother. Who was even born?" Mike laughed. "Two tough little men," John said and smiled, remembering the babies from yesterday. He suddenly had a strong desire to see Sarah and her newborn babies. Besides, he was curious to know how the young mother had gotten herself into such a strange situation. Having received the list and bought a lot of things, he hurried to the maternity hospital, where yesterday's acquaintance was taken. Seeing the man with huge bags, the nurses became animated. "Oh, what a generous father." "And who are you going to, young man?" the midwife asked. "To Sarah's. She gave birth to twins in my car yesterday," John replied cheerfully, and was surprised at the midwife's change in face. "In the car?" one of them asked, rounding her eyes. "And here we thought she was homeless. It's not like she had anything with her. He didn't even have a maternity card, and I bet the poor thing didn't go through any of the women's clinics. We had to put her in an overcrowded room." John felt uncomfortable with the judgmental stares of the women in labor and the clinic staff. "That's not my wife. And I'm not a daddy," he said. "It just happened." "Then why was a stranger giving birth in your car?" asked the old midwife. "Well, now I know him. Where's Sarah?" John replied. When he entered the room, he immediately identified where she was lying. Next to her was a completely empty bedside table. The other women in the room were full of groceries, clothes, and care products for themselves and their babies. It was obvious that their husbands and relatives had visited them. Sarah, on the other hand, had no one. She was wearing an old, long hospital gown and a lonely glass of water on the table. John's heart ached at the sight. He felt so sorry for Sarah. "Hello, heroic mother," he said with deliberate cheerfulness. John walked over to the bed where she was lying, her back turned to the wall. "Oh, John," she said, "well, you've come. Is all this for me?" "What's all this for?" It was obvious that she had been crying recently. Her eyes were slightly puffy, reddened. John marveled at the warmth and simplicity with which Sarah greeted him. "That's not all. There's a lot of stuff in the car. I'm not a stranger to you after all. Why are you crying?" "I'm just a little upset. I'm remembering my useless life. I've been running around in rooms lately. I worked in Chicago as a dishwasher. They paid me pennies. And then I couldn't even afford a place to live. I had to sleep in train stations or homeless shelters. Was it scary? I was all alone. And here I see, everyone visits moms with babies. No one needs me," Sarah sobbed. "Your sons need you," John reassured her. "Yes, they do. He's right, of course, but we'll have nowhere to go. My fiancé turned me down. My stepdad kicked me out of the house, said he didn't need any freeloaders, but he's drinking with his buddies, drinking our stuff. It's my mom's apartment. Actually, it was fine when she was alive. And now, oh, my poor sons," and Sarah wept bitterly. John had to lift her up to comfort her. He felt he had to help her. "Look, here's an idea," John suggested. "Let's say I hire you as a manager, and now I'm paying you sick pay and maternity leave. Tomorrow I'll get you a payroll card with your passport and rent an apartment for you and the boys. Are you okay with that?" Oh, Sarah couldn't believe her happiness and froze for a moment, staring at John with wide open eyes. "I'd be happy to work for you. Thank you." Taking her passport from her, John went to the office, where he instructed his assistant to handle Sarah's employment and compensation. Meanwhile, enthusiastic women gathered around Sarah's bunk. "What a man," admired her roommates. "Look, Sarah, hold on to him tightly. Do not miss such a golden man." "Come on, girls, I cannot take advantage of his kindness and impose on mistresses. It's not fair." "I was just hired," she replied modestly. The neighbors only smiled. It is true what they say, that from the outside you can see what is going on and who likes who. Well, 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 winked the oldest of the women in labor. Sarah just waved her hand and began to look at the presents. The next day, John visited her again to check on the health and well-being of the babies. Besides her, the whole ward was waiting for him. The doctors and patients were wondering what would happen next. Before their eyes, a miracle was happening, as if the audience fell into some movie, where a rich prince takes under the guardianship of a simple girl. And at the end of the story, that John and Sarah, as if did not notice the curious looks, they were absorbed in communication with each other and with the two little babies, which for a couple of days managed to recover and with surprise studied the world around them. John handed her a bank card and a brand new smartphone. Here, as promised. There should be enough there, so don't deny yourself anything. And if you need more, I'll give you some. Just tell me. Our employees receive money twice a month. Payments can be tracked by messages in your phone. I don't even know how to thank you. Sarah was embarrassed. Sometimes I feel like I'm dreaming. It makes me want to pinch myself. Come on, it doesn't cost me much, John said, and people need to be helped. Besides, you and I are already friends, aren't we? Wait till I'm godfather to your boys. By the way, what did you name them? John and Michael, Sarah replied. One in your honor, the other after my dad. He died early, but he was a good father. Thank you. It's my pleasure, John cheered. Okay, I've got to go now. Take care of yourself. I'll come again tomorrow. He said goodbye to the rest of his roommates and walked out, and a crowd of curious people gathered around Sarah again. Sarah, if it's no secret, how much did you get on your card? One of them inquired. I haven't looked yet, Sarah admitted. She picked up her phone, opened the message from the bank, and was stunned. The women came over and peered at the smartphone screen as well. They were filled with curiosity. All were amazed at John's generosity. Wow, that's what I mean. With this money, how much can one live comfortably? Oh, lucky you, Sarah, you got such a great guy, sighed one of the women in labor. Is he married, by the way? I don't know, Sarah sighed and grimaced. In truth, she liked John, of course, but she was afraid to show it, thinking he would see her as a money hunter. And what kind of hunter am I? Thought Sarah Smith with 2 children. But the thought that John might be married made her a little sad. The wardmates noticed this and silently went to their seats. They wanted the poor girl to be happy. Sarah's worries were justified. While John was visiting her in the hospital, Christine was met in one of the restaurants by Marina, the wife of Mike, John's business assistant, the same one who had been making a list of necessary items for Sarah and her children. Why are you out alone without your fiancé? Marina asked. You don't know yet? I left him. Let him bite his elbows now. Who needs him like that? Business nowadays is average, replied Christina. You shouldn't talk about his business like that. Mike said their company is doing well. They got a big order recently. Maybe their luck turned around after that noble deed, Marina informed him. What noble deed? Christina inquired, intrigued by her ex-fiance's sudden career rise. Poor thing, your John gave birth right in his brand new car. Can you believe it? Twins were born, and he visits her every day. Her name is Sarah. I think Marina smiled. Those are his kids. Christina switched to shouting. Why are you yelling? John said the kids aren't his. And it was the first time he'd seen them at all. There you are, you bad girl. Martha was taken aback and walked away, fearing Jessica's tantrums, for which the spoiled rich girl was famous throughout the city. Jessica's inflamed brain was already drawing lewd pictures of John and the stranger. And whose children are they then, if not his? Pissed off badly. Ah, it's Sarah. You turned out to be trickier than me. But the arrogant Jessica could not tolerate such humiliation. So she rushed to the maternity ward to sort things out. Which one of you is Sarah? She shouted as she burst into the room. It's me, Sarah replied. You poor wretched beggar, determined to steal my fiancé away from me. You think you bore him your ugly babies and you're happy. You're such a wretch. try to come near him. I'll strangle you, yelled the furious bride. My children are not ugly, and he is not their father. Get out of here, please, Sarah exclaimed weepingly. I'm not beating off anyone's fiancé. If you don't get out of here yourself, you're on your own. What do you know who my father is? He'd put your kids in an orphanage and you in jail. He'll find something to put you away for. Do you understand me, you thief of other men's men? Get out of here. You died in the wool czar. One of the laboring women got up from the bed and threateningly started to step on Jessica. Are you scaring our babies? Leave her alone, or you'll be out of here upside down, you prairie chicken. Jessica hadn't expected such a rebuff and backed away, looking around like a wounded animal. Slamming the door, Anna ran crying down the hall, escorted by the mocking glances of the staff. On the day of the discharge, John went to pick up Sarah and the children from the maternity hospital. The apartment for them was fully prepared and stocked with everything they needed. He bought flowers and treats for the nursing staff and everyone on the ward. John walked towards the ward with a joyful face. And Sarah's not here, the roommates said. She's gone. Gone how? Where John's hands dropped from this unexpected news. Yeah, some crazy blonde girl came by and insulted her in every way possible. Threatened her with jail. So Sarah ran away for good. Good thing we talked her into taking your bank card. Otherwise the girl would have disappeared, the old midwife complained. So where can we find her? It's a big city, John said, clutching his head. I think I know who frightened Sarah. The women just shrugged. Why did you hurt Sarah? Who gave you the right to act like that? Jessica had never seen John so furious before. That's how you'll know how to fend off other people's suitors, Jessica said capriciously. What fiances? I was just trying to help her out. Besides, you're kind of not my fiancé. Have you forgotten that you dumped me? I'm poor, ugly to you. John resented her. Whose kids are the kids then? Jessica asked snidely. How would I know? John exclaimed. It's none of my business. Are you out of your mind to suspect me? I've never cheated on you. God, I'm so glad I didn't propose to you that day. Maybe it was for the best that my car got towed and I was late for the restaurant. Sorry, Bunny. Jessica replaced anger with mercy when she realized she was losing such a lucrative party. You know I have my reasons for acting like this too. Hormones are playing up. Pregnant women are always like that. What pregnant women? Are you pregnant? John wondered. Yeah, that's why I'm freaking out. I'm not happy with myself. Without blushing, Jessica dialed it up on the spot. That's news, John exclaimed. Well, it's something to celebrate. Come on, I want champagne, the most expensive kind, said Jessica. But you can't have champagne, he said. Why is that? Pouted the girl. It's because alcohol is contraindicated for pregnant women. John marveled at such ignorance. Right, and I'd forgotten all about it. See, it's good to have you, she sang softly. After spending the evening with Jessica, John reflected. He was certainly excited about the baby, but he didn't see Jessica as his wife. He felt in his gut that she wasn't right for him, and if he married her, his life would be a nightmare. This thought John shared with his father, Stephen Gregory, who, from what he heard, came just furious. I don't even think about leaving Jessica. She's the daughter of my main business partner. You will marry her, and he and I will merge. Our capitals will become a powerful corporation, and Jessica's expecting my grandson. If you don't do as I say, I'll disinherit you. And it's too late to back down. You should have used your head. We don't abandon pregnant women and children, the father decided. All right, Dad, I'll do it. Schedule the wedding in 3 months, John sighed. That's good, Stephen Gregory soothed. Too bad your mother didn't live to see that day. John spent the next 2 months secretly trying to find Sarah, but his attempts were fruitless. Sarah had vanished into thin air. Jessica became even more capricious, speculating on a false pregnancy, which sometimes drove him mad. Rejoiced only one Stephen Gregory and spoiled the future daughter-in-law in every possible way. He even ordered for the future grandson of an expensive children's electric car. which were to be delivered from abroad. But time passed, and Jessica's belly did not grow, which worried the future father. John had already managed to study a ton of books on pregnancy and childbirth, and Jessica, to his surprise, wasn't interested. "When's your ultrasound appointment?" he asked his fiancée one day. "I'll go with you. They should already be able to see the arms, legs. It's so interesting, and I've got a lot of questions piling up for the doctor in a week," Jessica muttered. That evening, the pregnant woman called her friend, telling her of her problem. "What am I going to do? How am I going to tell John the first not pregnant? He's going to leave me right away," Jessica hysterical. "I have a miscarriage. It's a piece of cake. If you want, I can help you. I have a doctor I know. He owes my husband a lot of money. He'll make us a miscarriage certificate, and you'll pay the debt for him," advised her friend. "Wow, you're a genius," Jessica exclaimed. It looked like she had been saved. Her mood improved immediately, and she poured herself an impressive glass of red wine to celebrate the deed. And the next morning, our cheater went to the corrupt doctor, who arranged everything just right. The case was in the bag. All that remained was to present the news of the miscarriage in such a way as to frighten the gullible John and finally knock him out. Unsuspecting, John sat at his desk and studied the documents. A worried secretary walked in. "John Stevens," she said fearfully, looking at her boss. "The hospital here called to say that your fiancée has had a miscarriage. She is physically in satisfactory condition, but psychologically unstable. Jessica requests that you come for her immediately." "How awful!" exclaimed an astonished John. "So let's go to the hospital immediately." "Wait a minute, though. While you're waiting for the driver from lunch, you could be gone 100 times over. I'll drive myself." John ran out of the office. He didn't wait for the elevator, but went down the emergency stairs, jumping over a step. How could this be? His child was dead, and Jessica must be killing herself with grief. He should be there for her. John, taking his keys out of his pocket on the run, jumped out of the underground parking garage door like a scalded man. After scaring the security guard enough, he didn't remember how he'd ended up on the highway. His SUV was speeding away. Scary images of helpless Jessica and dead babies flashed through John's mind. Tears of grief filled his eyes. He had dreamed of being a father. John didn't notice how he drove into the oncoming lane, overtaking an elderly driver in an old car. But the road was too slippery after the rain, and John was too excited to see the dangerous turn in time. John woke up in a hospital bed. His head and back were hurting badly. A catheter had been placed in his arm, from which a thin tube stretched. A device was beeping nastily next to it. John wanted to sit up, but he couldn't. His legs wouldn't obey him. Not only that, he couldn't feel them at all. "Lie still, patient," the nurse said. Then she turned toward the corridor and shouted, "Doctor, he's awake." "Hello, John." An elderly doctor with glasses looked at the man. "Well, congratulations are in order. Looks like you were born with your shirt on. The car's dented and you're relatively okay. You're a lucky man." The doctor tried to make a joke. "What do you mean I'm fine?" "I can't feel my legs," John said fearfully. "That's the way it should be right now." "But unfortunately not," replied the doctor. "Your legs are inoperative because of the spinal injury. Things should get better after the surgery, but the procedure can only be performed after the body as a whole has recovered. The main thing is that his arms, legs, and head are in place, because, it happens that victims are brought in pieces. The main thing is not to worry, get plenty of rest. It's important now," and the doctor left, leaving orders for the nurse. Soon my father came into the room. His face looked aged and frightened, and there was an addition of gray hair on his head. "Son, I thought I was going to lose you like Mom. What happened? Why were you so driven?" Stephen Gregory asked. "I got word that Jessica had a miscarriage. I was upset and rushed to see her, replied John. The thought of losing his baby made his chest ache. While you were in a coma, that Jessica of yours found a new suitor and was hanging out with him at nightclubs. She doesn't look like she's grieving for her child. It's entirely possible she had us both fooled. Looks like there was no pregnancy. I had my people take a good look at the doctor who drew a miscarriage on her certificate, and he admitted that he was acting on her orders. Jessica was really after the money, not you. I've completely severed all relations with their family. Those bruises didn't look like they were going to go away that quickly. There's no guarantee her father won't let me down in business too. That bastard hasn't even apologized or visited you once. She's the reason you're here, and you could be crippled forever. Stephen Gregory clutched his heart when he heard his father's words. John had lost all interest in life. His eyes dimmed and his face became stony. How come there are people around who don't understand me, John thought. Everyone wants something from me. John no longer cared where he was, what he ate, or what was happening to him. He didn't care about his health at all. That's why he flatly refused any treatments, including physical therapy and exercises. John was always silent, never reacting to anyone. Even when he was brought home, where close friends and colleagues gathered to meet him, he did not care. He sat slumped in his wheelchair with a detached face. A month passed. It was time to prepare for surgery. Stephen Gregory, of course, was most worried about his son's fate. The doctors say you should do special exercises. It will help you overcome post-operative complications, the father said. I don't want to. I don't see the point. I'll do just fine as I am. No one wanted me healthy, and they didn't want me disabled, John replied despondently. Stephen Gregory saw how depressed he was. His father had hired the best therapists for him, but they had all failed. John simply refused to communicate with them. They had over a dozen professional caregivers with medical degrees, but they never lasted more than a week. John's temper had completely deteriorated. No one could endure his caustic remarks and refusal to obey the worker for long. "Take care of your son yourself," shouted the last of the nurses, whom John had pissed off. "You've completely lost your minds. I'm not your slave. I'm not going to take this kind of treatment," and left, slamming the door. Rumors of a harmful invalid quickly spread in the narrow circles of medical workers, and no one else wanted to care for John at any price. This function fell to Stephen Gregory and the elderly housekeeper, who already had a lot to do around the house. Desperate to find a decent caregiver, John's father placed an ad in the local newspaper. There were a lot of applicants, elderly grandmothers who needed care themselves, dashing-looking girls with colorful makeup, and heavy drinkers who could barely stand on their feet, and even a homeless man. Stephen Gregory was quick to turn them all away. One day there was a loud knock at their house. On the threshold stood a modest, pretty woman, who at first sight inspired Stephen Gregory trust, and he invited her into the house. "Hello, are you the one looking for a nurse for a sick man?" she asked. "I don't have a medical degree, but I took care of my grandmother. I can give injections, perform hygiene procedures, feed, take walks, and fill leisure time so that the person is not bored. But I won't be able to stay here overnight for family reasons. Here's my resume, take a look." "Good afternoon. I'm so glad you responded. I think you'd be a good fit for us. Come on, I'll introduce you to my son. He's 30 years old, and he's a good man. Only nervous because of his illness." Stephen Gregory was so pleased to see the nurse that he forgot to ask her name. He knocked on the door leading to John's room. "Who else is there? What do you want?" came the angry voice of Stephen Gregory. The nurse came into the room. When John saw her, he froze with shock at first, and then tears came to his eyes. "Sarah, have you come? I've been looking for you. Where have you been?" Sarah had and ran over to John. She sat down on her knees in front of his chair and began to feel his stiff legs. "Johnny, what's wrong? Can't you walk? How can you?" Anna exclaimed and cried. When Stephen Gregory saw his son's face partly clear, he breathed a sigh of relief. "How do you know each other so well?" he asked. "It's a long story." Dad John finally smiled. "I'll tell you about it later sometime." For the first time in 3 months, he was in high spirits. His father decided not to disturb them, so he simply went to his room, ordering them to serve a dinner tonight. It was necessary to respect the long-awaited guest. "What a sumptuous table," marveled Sarah as she entered the dining room that evening with John, who was cheerfully spinning the wheels of his wheelchair. "It's to show how pleased we are with you." Sarah Stephen Gregory perked up. "Thank you." "It's a pleasure," she rejoiced. "It's even kind of embarrassing to take money from you now." "You go ahead, don't make it up," John replied. "You need the money. I don't need you changing my pants for free. Every labor should be paid for. Especially labor like this, okay? I won't argue." "Just don't you worry, John," Sarah said worriedly. "You're not supposed to worry before surgery. Or have you forgotten what we agreed? So did you agree to the operation?" Stephen asked Gregory excitedly. "Of course we need to get back on our feet quickly," John said, and looked at Sarah, who was squeezing his hand tightly. Stephen Gregory realized that his son liked her and was a beneficial influence on him. That reassured him. A mild infatuation never hurt anyone, yet he thought, and invited everyone to the table. While John was busy working on his health, Jessica had managed to dump another beau who she thought was unworthy of her. Finding out that John was on the mend, and that the hated Sarah was living next door to him in his house, jealous Jessica decided to get back at them. She took a pen and a piece of paper and wrote an anonymous letter stating that Sarah was a dangerous, adventurous and wealth hunter who had gotten John pregnant on purpose a year ago and bore him twins. And now she is going to become the mistress of the house and the whole business. And Stephen Gregory himself, Sarah plans to give him to a nursing home to keep him out of the way. The next morning, the letter was sent by courier to Stephen Gregory. Upon reading the anonymous letter, the father was furious. He stormed into Sarah's room. "Is it true that you had children with John?" he asked angrily, glaring his eyes. "Yes, it just so happened," Sarah replied calmly. "Maybe you also like my son?" he asked wryly. "Yes," she admitted honestly. "But John doesn't know anything about it, so that's why you came here to marry him off," Stephen yelled. "I wanted our money, eh? You'll get by." "That's what I just came to work," exclaimed Sarah. "Get out of my house." And Stephen Gregory pointed to the door. Sarah was not allowed to say goodbye to John. There was nothing left for her to do but leave this house. "Where's Sarah?" John asked when he arrived in his wheelchair for breakfast. "I kicked her out," said his father. "What do you want that Anashenko for? There's no need for us to get inbred with her yet." "Oh, really?" John exclaimed. "You've got yourself a baron, and you have no right to control other people's destinies. You once asked me to marry Jessica. And how did that turn out? Look what happened to me." John took offense and went off to the garden near the house. His father remained seated at the table, reading the letter. Half an hour later, he went to apologize to his son and confess that perhaps he had believed the anonymous letter for nothing. But he didn't find John. A search was organized in the street, and even the police were involved. But the stroller tracks broke off on the road. "What have I done?" "You old fool," Stephen Gregory clutched his head and cried. In the evening, he found Sarah's resume where she had left her address, and the next morning he went there. The house was on the very edge of town. Stephen Gregory knocked on the door. He was opened by an elderly landlady who immediately realized who stood before her. The Smith family, all the details of their life were known to everyone in town. The grandmother nodded silently at the room where Sarah and the children were seated. "What do you want?" she asked when she saw the offending man enter. Stephen Gregory was silent. He couldn't find the words, an apology. Besides, his gaze was fixed on two chubby-cheeked babies who were walking amusingly while lying in a crib. "How cute," he said as he approached the children. "I'd forgotten how beautiful babies can be. I'm getting old. I've forgotten how it was when I was young. I've lost my head for business." "I'm sorry," Sarah snapped at you. I got an anonymous letter with all sorts of nasty things written about you, so I freaked out. I hurt your feelings. I didn't know what I was talking about. So you had a baby. You had a baby with your son. It's not my business. My business is to provide a decent life for my grandchildren. All right, she smiled. But these are not your grandchildren. They're from my fiancée, who's long gone, and John just helped me when I was in dire need. You raised a decent man. I'm the one who should be thanking you for him. When Sarah told the details of her life, Stephen Gregory was ashamed. Who took care of the little ones while you were working here? Asked Grandma Martha, the landlady. I owe her a great deal, said Sarah. So that's it, pack up with the kids and back to our place of permanent residence. I've got some not so good news though. My John is missing. He went off somewhere in a wheelchair. Never came back, said Stephen Gregory. Missing how? Sarah said worriedly. We have to find him, don't we? What if something happened to him? What if he needs help? What kind of wheelchair-bound invalid are you talking about? Grandma Martha heard everything and decided to cut into the conversation. Isn't it a young man with black hair and a red jacket? Yes, that's him, Stephen and Sarah shouted in unison. So he's staying with Peter, our vagabond. He's so clever. He's got a new tenant. He fixed Peter's television. Yesterday I took the iron to him for repair. Now the iron works as good as new. Sarah ran out into the yard first. Stephen Gregory could hardly keep up with her when they burst into the old shack, not without a knock. Out of breath from running, they found John alive and well. He was sitting there fixing an old electric stove. How did you frighten me, John? Father exclaimed. So you almost gave your father a heart attack, Sarah said menacingly. Well, how can you be such a slacker? You've got surgery coming up. We were worried you'd drive us crazy, Dad said. Sarah, hold me, or I won't serve him now. John laughed loudly and happily. He realized that his two favorite people had found common ground, and it made him happy. Yeah, I want to go home, he said. Where are John and Alex? They're home. They're being looked after. Don't worry, Sarah reassured him. As they walked noisily into Stephen's house, Anna, the housekeeper, splashed her hands together. She was delighted to see the sullen house come alive again. Sarah had allocated the brightest, warmest rooms for the little ones. John personally supervised all the preparations. The father rejoiced at his son's transformation. When evening came and John was playing with the children, Sarah quietly approached Stephen Gregory and hugged him. Thank you for everything, Stephen Gregory, Sarah whispered softly. I'll tell you a secret. John asked me to marry him, and I said yes. Now that's news. Call me Daddy, Sarah, Stephen Gregory said affectionately. A few months later, John was already moving around the house, albeit with a stick, but on his own 2 feet, and gave instructions to a team of workers who were building a warm gazebo in the garden for winter walks with the kids. The operation was a success. In addition, the problem was not as serious as the doctors had feared. That's why John recovered quite quickly. They had the wedding right at the manor house. They didn't invite many guests. They invited only close friends and relatives. The young people were happy. There were good wishes, loud toasts, and of course shouts of bitter. In the midst of the festivities, Jessica showed up uninvited. She was no longer that beautiful girl, but looked depressed and devastated. Everyone fell silent, expecting a trick from the self-loving girl. What insolence was heard from all sides. How dare she come here? I apologize for disturbing your idyll, Jessica said with her head down. I came to apologize to all of you. John, Sarah, I sincerely wish you happiness. Forgive me if you can. Jessica held a small, neatly wrapped gift in her hands, which she placed with trembling hands with the rest of the presentations. John looked disdainfully at her offering. He wanted nothing from the one who had caused his family so much pain. The vow of silence was interrupted by Sarah. She was the one who knew better than anyone what it was like to be a social outcast. "Jessica, I don't know about John, but I forgive you. Today is such a happy day, and I don't want to overshadow it. Thank you for the gift. It takes courage to do that, to admit your mistakes. Come on in, make yourself at home. You know everything here better than I do," and Sarah smiled. Jessica, not expecting this kind of participation, cried openly. It was as if something in her soul had burst and the dam of accumulated shame and grief had burst. It was clear that something very bad had happened in her life. Sarah came out from behind the desk and put her arms around her, pulling her close. "Come on, are you going to tell us everything?" she said quietly and pulled Jessica with her. She didn't resist. Obediently, she followed Sarah, realizing that she could get help here. As much as John didn't want to see his ex-fiancée, her state of mind shook him, and he agreed to listen to her. After drinking some soothing drops, Jessica began to pour out her soul. "My father died suddenly of a heart attack a month ago," she began her story. "My mom and I were left all alone. The company's fortunes began to deteriorate because of my father's departure. Investors were afraid to cooperate with us. And then Victor appeared, our savior. I trusted him. He courted me so nicely, said he was a top manager of a big company. He drove an expensive car, gave me luxurious gifts. My mother loved him and wanted him for a son-in-law. Our house was open to him at any time of day. And then Vitya offered to sell the company and invest all my father's money in cryptocurrencies. He promised that now it was growing in value and you could make a lot of money on the difference when reselling it. I transferred all the money to the right wallet, just like he said. I trusted him. And the next day Victor disappeared, moved out of the hotel, and his phone was unavailable. We realized Victor was a fraud. Turns out he even had a rented suit. He robbed us blind. My mom and I had our house foreclosed on. I still have some money left in my account, but it'll be gone soon, and they won't hire me anywhere. They say I don't have experience. That scoundrel, and Jessica showed a photo of her boyfriend on her phone. It's to die for Sarah, couldn't help herself. So this is my ex-fiancé Vitya, who swindled the last of my money and ran away when he found out I was pregnant. Now that's a coincidence. Yes, you and I, Jessica, are now unfortunate friends. By the way, I know where he might be holed up. I heard an address he gave to a cab driver once. Let's see if we can get your money back. In the meantime, stay with your mom at our place. I think there's plenty of room for everyone. Can't we just stay friends? I don't have any real girlfriends, Jessica said. And believe me, I've changed. I know what it's like to have no money and rich people looking at you funny. What kind of a fool was I to act like that? You certainly were, Sarah smiled. And they laughed. And then they talked for a long time about something. A strong friendship was budding between them. John decided not to disturb them and went to see his sons, whom he missed very much. The next morning, Jessica wrote a police report on Victor and attached a photo of the fraudster and bank statements to the case file. For his part, John involved an experienced detective. Together they found Victor's trail. And in time, he was already processing the next victim. The money was returned to Jessica. She was happy and bought for her mother and herself a small, cozy house, already much more modest than it was. John, will you let me be your business partner? You're the one I want to entrust the remaining capital to, Jessica asked. Deal. Partner John smiled and looked at his ex-fiancée. He no longer resented her. Jessica had really changed, becoming softer in character and easier to talk to. In addition, her favorite friend Sarah had a positive influence on her. Every evening, John hurried home from work, where his large family was waiting for him. One evening, Peter greeted him and continued trimming the bushes. He was the same hobo who had picked up a freezing John by the roadside when he had run away from home. Peter proved to be an excellent gardener, The garden had been transformed by his arrival. "Well done," Peter John said. "By the way, your house is almost ready. You can move in a couple of days." As soon as John stepped on the threshold of the house, Caesar came running toward him. On his neck hung a note. The dog wagged his tail and spun around happily, so John had to do his best to get the strange message away from him. When John unfolded the note, he saw the words that every loving man dreams of. "You're going to be a daddy again soon." And in the dining room there was a large family waiting for him. A happy father, a wife, 2 sons, a faithful dog, and someone else whose arrival everyone was eagerly awaiting.